briefly in terms of the curriculum, I think that we should, in our history curriculum, teach a shared history. A history that, in my view, teaches people that we have got things wrong in the past and we should look at the different ways in which that is the case. But of course, never loses sight of the fact that we remain the greatest country on the planet this current day. But I think that when we're teaching, I think there is more of a role, and there's further we could go in terms of teaching the history of black people in this country, the contributions they've made. But I'm very keen that that's done as part of a shared history. I wouldn't support anything that promotes separateness and alternative historical narratives. I mean, ultimately, we've got to have white boys and girls, black boys and girls, other background groups, all in the same classroom, learning a shared history together, and that does include looking at the injustices that have happened in the past. It does include that, but it also includes the message that there is so much more that binds us together than that separates us all as well. Touching upon current issues in the media, I mean, like other honourable members, I was appalled by the death of George Floyd. I was absolutely appalled. I would say I found it slightly disappointing. I think that the vast majority of people who have gone on the protests, I think, are well-meaning. And I agree with the Honourable Member for Wickham that we should listen to their strength of their feeling and how they feel. But I do think it is unfortunate that some of the leadership figures of BLM have at times strayed beyond what should be a powerful yet simple and unifying message in opposition to racism that still exists in our society, straying into cultural Marxism, the abolition of the nuclear family, defunding the police, overflowing capitalism. So in some senses, I find it quite regretful that a message and an agenda that should have been unifying at times has been allowed to become very divisive, but ultimately it's our duty to make sure the right messages are learned from that horrific incident. And I think that it needs to be one of unity, moderation, and looking to improve upon the situation we have today where we know that racism still exists. I'd also, looking at the petition, like to be a little bit careful about the term institutional racism. Yes, I think we need to be alive for the fact that there will be individuals who harbour racist views within key institutions, whether they be schools or the police, and they need to be rooted out. But I think to smear an entire organisation as being institutionally racist, again, I think is incredibly unhelpful and divisive. I remember the Honourable Member for Saffron Walden, and I remember her speaking 3 or 4 years ago about this topic, and I thought she'd be a future Mayor of London at the time, actually. And right now, I wish she was. However, we have an opportunity, perhaps next May, to get the first black Mayor of London, and I hope that the people of London take that. Thank you very much.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In opening the debate, my honourable friend, Member for Erith and Thamesmead, whom I congratulate, called for a review of the national curriculum for us to have a better understanding of our history being taught and of the struggles and the contributions of black people within it. She's absolutely right about that, and I'm glad that that proposition has had widespread support in this debate. I was pleased to see in the comprehensive improvement plan for the Home Office that was published last month, in the wake of the response to the Windrush scandal, within that recommendation 6, which is to implement a learning plan on UK history within the Home Office. Well, it's definitely needed in the Home Office, but it's needed in schools and it's needed in our wider society as well. And when the review is done, I'd just like to make the case for including important recent contributions which have been made in the borough I represent. I was there in the early 1980s when the first generation of Asian young people was making its way through the education system. In September 1983, after a series of incidents in and around Little Ilford School, this was just a few months before I became a governor of that school, racist thugs started to attack young Asian pupils, and the young people started to organise to defend themselves. 8 Asian youngsters who were essentially the victims of racism were arrested and charged with conspiracy. They were the Newham 8. They secured massive community support, not least from other young people, and they were eventually cleared as the courts recognised that they were acting in self-defence, or they were given minimal community sentences. That campaign and many others secured change. Racism was defeated. The culture was changed, and I pay tribute to those who, despite being young, took a stand and won. My friend and colleague Unmesh Desai, now City and East London member of the Greater London Authority, serving on that with the Honourable Member for Orpington, who's in his place, and indeed with my honourable friend who opened the debate as a colleague at the authority as well. He now chairs the GLA Police Committee. He played a key role in that Newham campaign. I pay tribute to him, and the Newham Monitoring Project, which started at that time, plans a teacher's resource pack on the Newham 8 story next spring. We need our curriculum to cover important parts of our history like that one. And one of the lessons is that those battles, having been won, often have to be fought all over again when the problems reoccur. My honourable friend in opening also called for a race equality audit of government policy, and I just want to focus on one policy in particular, the policy on no recourse to public funds, under which many hard-working, law-abiding black families, when they lose their employment, as many have done in this pandemic, during a 10-year period in which they have to pay large fees to renew their leave to, and thousands in fees, to renew their leave to remain every 2.5 years, those families are barred from applying for social security. There are 1.4 million people across the UK who can't access the benefit system for this reason, including families with 175,000 children. 100,000 families have had that condition imposed on them in the past year. The Unity Project, which does superb work in this area, recently reported that out of a group of 140 families that they were working with, this a condition imposed on them, 77% are black African, 12% are black Caribbean. Certainly the overwhelming proportion of those affected are from the ethnic minorities. There is a disproportionate impact on black British children. 85% of the families in the Unity Project research had at least one child who is a British citizen. Madam Deputy Speaker, that policy would not survive the race equality audit proposed by my honourable friend is in opening this debate. As the Unity Project puts it, NRPF is inherently more likely to affect BME British children than white British children, indicating the indirect racially discriminatory impact of the condition. Is that the intention of the policy? No, it isn't. But it is the impact of it, and we need to address it.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am proud to represent the constituency of Kensington, which has Notting Hill and North Kensington at its beating heart. When the Windrush generation came to the UK, I am delighted to say that many settled in Notting Hill and the Ladbroke Grove area. We saw the birth of one of the most iconic cultural celebrations of black British life, the Notting Hill Carnival. And while clearly that was not able to physically take place this year, I'm glad to say it went ahead virtually. There is so much to celebrate about the black community in Kensington. And I am delighted that my council has recognised that this month in awarding Black History Month grants to many local groups and institutions to celebrate the involvement of black British people in our cultural life. One of those was the Harrow Club, a really inspirational charity and youth club that I had the pleasure of taking the Home Secretary to see at the beginning of this year. Now, there is so much talent in the black community. It's being referred to in the arts, in media, in film, in sport. We must harness that talent. We must also understand that that talent is not only in the creative arts, it is also in business, which is my background. There are so many talented black people in the corporate world, so many young, talented black entrepreneurs in my constituency who want to go out there, set up businesses, create wealth, and create opportunities for the wider community. Now, we must also recognise the challenges in the black community, a number of which have been referred to. Clearly, the treatment of many of the Windrush generation by successive governments, Labour and Conservative, was unacceptable. Now, those injustices cannot be unwound, but I am glad to say that the Home Secretary has accepted the recommendations of the Wendy Williams Review. The recent coronavirus crisis has also shown health inequalities. Again, I'm glad to say that my honourable friend on the front bench is leading on 6 new research projects to look at the correspondence between COVID and ethnicity. And if we look at average hourly earnings, they are still less amongst black people in the age group of 30 plus. But interestingly, between blacks and whites, it is almost even up in the 16 to 30 year age group. And interestingly, the Chinese community and the Indian community surpassed the white community in both of those age groups. That's why this government's agenda of levelling up is so important. And it's not only levelling up between the North and the South, it's levelling up within our inner cities. I believe passionately in equality of opportunity, and that's equality of opportunity in education, in the workplace, in healthcare. So let us celebrate the huge contributions that the black community have made to Kensington and to the UK, and let us look forward to even more in the future.
Flora Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to echo the congratulations of other members to the Member for Erithing Thamesmead for securing this very important debate, which I'm sure will be very influential in the life of our country. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, over 500 people in Putney, Roehampton and Southfields contacted me wanting to know what action would be taken, because they found that this really struck a chord with their own lives, their own experience, and the society that we don't want to be in this country. And for many of them, it was key to this demand was to talk about our education system as at the roots of some of the problems that we have in our society. They demanded that there was a call for every school child to be taught honestly and truthfully about Britain's colonial history in particular. And I pay tribute to all of those young people who wrote to me, and all of the teachers as well, who are doing and want to do more in their schools. It's essential that Britain must wrestle with and reckon with our colonial past. It's part of our history. But as has been said many times, we also must need to do all that we can to ensure that we value and celebrate the achievements of Black Britons and Black people across the world. And that's what's so important, I think, about Black History Month. It's not just about history, it's about our current world and life at the moment, and it's a time to really celebrate activism, that activism that's brought us to where we are today, but also how much we have to go ahead. And this can't be a voluntary add-on. Government ministers I've heard in other previous debates have listed all the opportunities for bringing in Black history into the curriculum as it stands, both primary and secondary. But it's not good enough that this is just optional for some teachers in some schools. And I welcome the call by the member for Erithing Thamesmead for a review of the national curriculum. And I would add to that the demands of the Black Curriculum campaign that there is a compulsory module for Black history in Key Stage 3. Developing curricula takes careful planning and research. So if the government is really to take up the call of this afternoon and really believe that we can teach the colonial legacy accurately, and every child can learn about Black people's contributions, it also needs to back this up with resourcing for schools. And I would also like to pay tribute to UNICEF's Rights Respecting campaign. Schools that are rights respecting, and you can go through the various colours, bronze, silver and gold, do have the opportunity to then look at Black history across the curriculum within the context of rights. And many schools in my constituency have used this to great benefit. Would you give way on that one? I will.
I'm very grateful to her, because I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, what it shows is that the innovations at a local level of teaching history and having history festivals can bring about huge differences. Our own Gloucester History Festival, in fact, today is the last day that anyone in this house and outside can listen to Yanina Ramirez's conversation with David Olusuga on the gloucesterhistoryfestival.co.uk site, free of charge. A wonderful discussion with one of our leading Black history historians, and that is the sort of thing that can make a huge difference to young people's perception. Would she agree?
I would agree, and what an excellent advertisement for an event. And I would also add to that the work by Putney High School and by Chestnut Grove Academy as well, who've taken up the challenge to really look at the challenge of Black history and continue with innovation, and the teachers that are doing this. So I'm joining this call for the compulsory module that every student must learn. Making this is a strong first step. It means that all children will learn about Black history, not those who can go along to any festival or whose teachers have the time and resources to teach it. A compulsory module will, as I've said, will require teaching, training for teachers and the development of resources. And so I'm joining the call for the Department for Education to put in place a plan for the proper teaching of Black history across our curriculum. As a society, we must commit to an education system that fights racism, where every child can see their place in it and can see their full potential can be realised, that recognises the true and painful legacy of slavery and colonialism and puts it in the correct context, but also values the achievements of Black people, and that takes us forward to a society that will not have any racism, that doesn't need to have a debate that we're having this afternoon, and that can see that we are truly equal and can all achieve our potential in our society. Black history is British history and should be taught all year round. Thank you.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to speak in this debate on such important matters, as so many have said before. And I want to start off with a really positive message that the UK has traditionally been one of the most open, tolerant, welcoming and diverse countries in the Western world, with some of the lowest levels of hate crime in Europe. And this is consistently found in a number of recent large-scale studies, such as the Eurobarometer poll and the World and European Values surveys. We can be clear that there is much more to be done. Yes, we can agree that even one example of racial hatred and prejudice is wrong. Yes. But we must nonetheless acknowledge that the vast majority of people in this country are open, tolerant, accepting when it comes to diversity issues. And I know my constituents certainly are. Where there are threats to tolerance and peaceful coexistence, they come from both sides of society, the left and the right. And it is clear that active xenophobia, racism and violence are totally unacceptable in this country. And we should challenge that by responding swiftly with the full force of the law, and rightly so. Black History Month is a great opportunity for celebration. But on education and curriculum, I think equally we should be clear and tackle some other areas, such as the cancel culture, where attempts to close down debate, discussion and learning in our universities and other educational institutions, and seeks to influence society by instilling sometimes political ideologies into what should be a neutral and fact-based educational curriculum. In my view, we must not politicise education. Where that happens, it is a feature of some of the most oppressive regimes in the world.
Well, the honourable member who's making a very good case about not allowing cancel culture to infuse our society agree with me that the renaming of the David Hume Tower in Edinburgh University is a good example of what shouldn't happen. A great 18th century philosopher, great figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, and his name taken away from the tower because of one footnote in one essay 300 years ago. Does he agree with me that that is not helpful to the teaching of history or black history?
Hear, hear.
The honourable member makes a very good point. We know there are many instances of this happening. We can be talking about things such as the proms, which we saw before, episodes of faulty towers being taken off air, and politicians not being allowed to speak in university debates because perhaps their views differ to that of the university. And so I do take your point entirely that, yes, there are many areas here, which is why I bring this to the foot of the House. But to carry on, regimes which fear free thinking, articulate citizens who may use their learning and their fluency of thought to think for themselves, in a free democratic country, we need to have no such fears. We must never permit our education system to become a vehicle for politics or politicising. Our schools and universities have always been and need to remain places of learning. They are places whose primary duty is to instill a love of learning, a love of thinking, and a love of free expression, and to equip young people with the skills to think for themselves. This is why calls to decolonise our curriculum gives me a little concern. And I would say that our nation's history is one of great breadth and depth, but we all know it is nuanced. There are examples of great triumphs and advances which have benefited civilization in all kinds of ways. But equally, there are examples of great failures and aspects of our past which, through modern eyes and by today's standards, are shameless. All we need to do is teach. Teach that history, warts and all, and to encourage as wide a range of perspectives as possible and facilitate the conversations which will empower young people to form their own conclusions about the issues which shape the world around them and to be meaningful contributors to the wider conversation. And this is what we do every day. It is the corner of our democracy. Our educational institutions should be reflections of the openness with which we debate, disagree, compromise, and even find agreement here in Parliament. As Robert Maynard Hutchins said, the objective of education is to prepare the young to educate themselves throughout their lives. But it was Francis Bacon who put it best: read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, for securing this important debate and for the passion and eloquence with which she opened the debate. And I echo her calls to everyone who wants to make change happen to register to vote in next year's elections. And I'm pleased to be speaking in Black History Month debate today, particularly given the many Luton South constituents who have signed the parliamentary petitions on teaching Black history as part of a more inclusive curriculum. And I've heard many others speak about their experiences at school, and I want to pay tribute to the fantastic education I got at a diverse working class comprehensive and the experiences I had that has enabled me to stand here as an ally in this debate with my black and brown friends from school. I also want to pay tribute to my former teacher, Mr. Taylor, who did his bit for Black history education over 30 years ago. But he wasn't a history teacher, he was our drama teacher. And he not only recognised the importance of teaching Black history, but that education comes in many forms. And he recognised the power of drama and creativity to engage young people of all races with knowledge and ideas. And this is not politicising education, as the Honourable Member across said. It's importantly enabling young people to better understand the world around them. And so, like I said, this is how a diverse bunch of working class kids from a comprehensive in Luton in the 80s learned about the life and actions of Martin Luther King and the wider civil rights movement in America, through creating a play of his life in the form of a Greek tragedy, with the chorus reiterating that Martin Luther King, he was black. And we performed it at the end of end of term show, and my mum says you could have heard a pin drop. And I take that with me now when I'm in this debate, because I have now been given the opportunity to stand up once again for my friends. People have referenced a shared history, and we must all own that shared history. But what I can say is the racism experienced by my friends at school, and sometimes me alongside them for being their friend, makes that shared history sharing really painful. And so we cannot just say, it's a shared history, let's explore it. Because my experience of that history is very different to the experience of my black and brown friends. I want to reflect on how we recognise and celebrate black history and important black role models in my hometown of Luton. And I do this by taking a moment to celebrate Luton's first black woman mayor, Councillor Desleen Stewart. She was mayor in the mid-1990s, and she served our town as a local councillor for over 30 years, and I was pleased to serve alongside her as a local councillor for a number of years too. Desleen was one of the key founders of Mary Seacole Housing Association in my constituency of Luton South. In the 1980s, Desleen responded to direct pleas from young people who were running away from home. They sought her out as she had built a reputation for her philanthropic work, accommodating people from a wide range of backgrounds, and she welcomed everyone into her kitchen if they needed help. Over time, more and more people went to her for help until it was clear she would need to increase her outreach. And so with the support of local politicians, grants from Urban Aid and support from Luton Council, Luton Churches, a recommendation to the Housing Corporation resulted in the purchase of the first 2 houses on Brantwood Road to support her work. And so here is another example about how educating about black history comes in all forms. Desleen chose to name the Housing Trust because she wanted to recognise Mary Seacole, who, as we know, was a pioneering British-Jamaican nurse and heroine of the Crimean War, who overcame racism and injustice to nurse soldiers during the Crimean War 200-odd years ago. Desleen felt a strong kinship with Mary Seacole and wanted to recognise her humanitarian work and altruism. Desleen believed that there was an affinity between her own rescuing of homeless young people with Seacole's nursing of wounded soldiers on the battlefield. So in celebrating black history, which is British history, we must remember that much of that history is recent and much of that history is local.
After the next Honourable Member, I'll have to reduce the time limit to 4 minutes, but on 5 minutes, we have Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to congratulate the member for Erith and Thamesmead for securing this important debate. Because Black History Month is a fantastic opportunity to celebrate the contribution that black people and those with black heritage have made to our country's history. That is truly a positive thing. Now, there are naturally aspects of our past that are negative. A history that involves an empire and commonwealth is inevitably mixed. The history of specific issues is mixed, as this year has perhaps shown. Among them, we cannot forget the stain of slavery, but nor should we forget our country's role in ending slavery. It's worth recalling that when America was engulfed in the Civil War, with its southern states fighting to literally keep people in chains, our country had peacefully banned the trade for over half a century and the practice for 3 decades. Our history isn't perfect, but I believe it shows us to be an open and tolerant country. Black History Month is full of examples. I was particularly pleased this year to learn about Alan Glacier Minns. He became the mayor of Thetford and the first black mayor in the United Kingdom in 1904. As a member of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, I'm pleased to tell the House that he was in fact a local doctor. And standing on the government side of the House, I'm also pleased to say that he was a Conservative. I gather that Thetford is now planning a statue in his honour, and so they should, because black history is British history, and British history belongs to all of us. Our identity as British is not a matter of race. Instead, when we search ourselves, we find that we are defined by our institutions, and above all, by the Crown, this Parliament, and our common law. Our institutions are relevant to all of us. The history of their hard-won evolution is therefore relevant to all of us. Relevance is not determined by the colour of one's skin, nor is belonging. Our country continues to welcome people from across the world, not just to live here, but to belong here. Our cultural richness is something to celebrate, and Black History Month is part of that. Unfortunately, some political activism has a counter-narrative which stresses our differences and which tries to reduce us to them. It also denies a role to people as individuals in order to subsume them into a group. This approach is profoundly dangerous. It used to be the racists who opposed or denied the possibility of social integration. It would be tragic if the good intentions of anti-racists resulted in forms of segregation. Yeah. My own constituency is a standing rebuke to those ideas. Peterborough is highly diverse, but we stand together and we are stronger together. The recent COVID pandemic saw us all come together, black, brown, white, on all minorities. We fed and we housed rough sleepers. We delivered supplies to those that were shielding. We supported charities and voluntary-led organisations. We did this, Madam Deputy Speaker, as Peterboroughians, as people from Peterborough, not as individually laboured groups. We are one city. We are proud of our city, proud of our country, and proud to mark Black History Month. And I'd like to pay tribute to Bernadette Amendi, or Sherry, as she's often known, because she is the chair of the Peterborough Racial Equality Council and the Black History Month Committee. Sherry and her team are a tremendous force for good in my city. While COVID has prevented the annual celebration of Black History Month in Cathedral Square, they have delivered food parcels to the needy. They've supported people with mental health issues. They've raised money for charity at a Lush shop in Peterborough. And I'm looking forward to joining them, Sherry and her team, in a Black Summit to address a number of issues with the City Council and the local police. She recognises, like I, that we won't be able to reach our potential as a country and as a city unless people of colour also reach their potential. No one symbolises my one city message more than Sherry and her team, and they make me proud of Peterborough.
Yeah. Bob Seeley.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Black History Month, I think, originated in the United States, where it's also known as African American History Month, and it was created to remember important people and events in the history of African diaspora there. And in the mid-1980s, Ansel Wong led an initiative here, which eventually resulted in Black History Month in the United Kingdom, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's important not to miss the real point of this debate, and I'd like to argue what Black History Month should be, and maybe what it shouldn't be. This is not about appeasement to ethnic minorities, because it's an important part of British history, and it's an important part of history for all of us in this country. And it sits alongside other histories, social histories, military histories, post-war histories, or of peoples as well, such as the modern experience of Sikhs and British Jewry and Muslims in this country too. And as for the Isle of Wight, our African history, Black history, goes back to the Roman Empire, because we had people from North Africa, people from Italy on the island, because we were an early point of habitation by Romans and the Roman Empire when it was in this country. I do feel that Black History Month is getting caught up in other issues and unnecessarily politicised, because it is a fascinating subject in its own right. It is not about silly slogans about decolonisation. It is not about the tedious debate about woke activism or the cancel culture eloquently described by my honourable friends from Ipswich and North Norfolk. Nor is it solely, certainly, about the drumbeat of slavery, although it is an important moral, economic and political issue. And on that point, until the UK abolished it, however depressing we may feel, slavery was a consistent norm in human experience. And our state, at the height of its power 2 centuries ago, used that power for an absolute moral good, manumission, the destruction of the international slave trade off West Africa. And indeed, the West Africa Squadron, that used a considerable amount of the Royal Navy's resources at the time, as the honourable member from Wakefield eloquently pointed out, was a unique vehicle in history. As part of the most powerful military institution of that era, the Royal Navy, was used for an absolute moral good, the destruction of slavery. And yes, our history is complex, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the time of destroying slavery, we were also accumulating an empire. So it is easy to make accusations of hypocrisy, but rather than stand here like some agitprop student politician, I would rather understand the past and the complex worlds in which people lived before us inhabited, because it can help guide our way, frankly, to a better future.
Would my honourable friend, on that very point, you'd be interested that we only have one major statue of a slaver in Gloucester. It happens to be the Emperor Nerva of the Roman Empire, who did indeed take slaves from the UK back to Italy. We haven't done anything to daub him at all.
No, I do wonder if some previous constituents from a couple of millennia ago were part of that trade. I hope not. So as a Trinidadian friend tells me, you don't help one group of people by pulling down others. And I think black history is fundamentally about so much more, whether it's a story of peoples such as the Windrush generation. And I actually pay tribute to the extraordinary courage that you needed to get on that boat to come here from the Caribbean after World War II. I think it was an extraordinary thing. Or individuals like Mary Seacole, who was turned down by the War Office when she wanted to go and help British soldiers in the Crimea, so she got funding herself and went herself. Lillian Bader, leading aircraft woman Lillian Bader, the first black woman to join the armed forces in World War II. She ended up as a corporal. Joan Armatrading, the first ever UK artist to be nominated for the Grammy in the Blues category. First black peer, Lord Constantine, Trevor MacDonald, incredibly well known. Or even on the Isle of Wight, where our modern cultural history, I'm sure Derek Sandy's classic reggae, Welcome to the Isle of Wight, will heavily feature. So there's much debate here about genuine Black History Month as opposed to politicised statements around race. And on one side, I have to say, I think we've had a rather negative view of our history of humanity, of a world divided into oppressors and victims. And on this side, I think a rather more optimistic view of human nature. And whilst humanity is not perfect, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think there's much to celebrate. I'm very proud of this country. I'm proud of our record. Life is not perfect, and neither are we. But the way we make that better is to understand the world, and that I hope that is what Black History Month will help us do. Thank you.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Deputy Speaker, and I congratulate the member for Erith and Thamesmead for securing this important debate. Now, I was born and brought up in Greenock, the main town of the constituency of Inverclyde, and as a child it was just my hometown. My main memory of a school trip to the local James Watt Museum was walking a friend, eyes closed, past a snarling stuffed bear, certainly little of our colonial history. And I never thought twice of some of the street names I walked down: Jamaica Street, Antigua Street, Virginia Street, or what some of the merchants who built some of the larger houses in the town might have traded in. Hidden in plain sight, another history of the place where I was growing up. Because Greenock, like other ports, sadly played its part in the North Atlantic slave trade. It was a port where traders carrying goods like iron and guns would depart to West Africa, and these goods would be traded for enslaved people, who were then transported to the Americas and sold in exchange for goods like sugar. And as a child, the only sugar I was aware of in relation to Greenock was the Tate and Lyle refinery and the wreck of the sugar boat MV Catanis in the Firth of Clyde. The water was supposed to taste sweet round about it. That sugar was then transported back to the refineries of Greenock, and the warehouse, the sugar shed, still stands to this day. That sugar and the rum and the tobacco, it made some incredibly wealthy. But that wealth was not just kept in the pockets of the traders and their families. It's important that we acknowledge that it enriched all Scots and all parts of the UK. And this was recently highlighted by the excellent blog and Twitter account Weird Scotland. Much of the philanthropy of the 18th and 19th centuries in Scotland, a lot of which admirably focused on promoting access to education, which we've talked about a lot today, was in fact funded by the slave trade. The Royal Academy in Tain, for example, in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Caithness, Strath, Sutherland and Easter Ross, was opened in 1813 by Hugh Rose Ross of Gastullach, an enslaver, and funded by £175,000 in today's money from donors in the Caribbean. So it's not just our places and our institutions, but it is our people who have deep-rooted connections to the slave trade. The most famous Greenokin, other than Victor Meldrew, is James Watt. His father was a slave trader, and while Watt did eventually argue for abolition, there is no doubt that he benefited from his father's wealth and sold steam engines to plantations in the Caribbean. I'd highlight Sean Kavanagh's excellent piece on Greenock's role in the slave trade, where he says, "In Greenock we live in the shadow of slavery every day." And how many people walk along the streets of Greenock, Glasgow, Edinburgh and elsewhere and fail to connect the dots, to realise the wealth realised via the slave trade. And it's true that even Scotland's bard, Robert Burns, in financial straits, accepted a job as part of a team of white overseers on a plantation in Jamaica. Clark McGinn outlines, being a bookkeeper was as much about managing the assets as the numbers. Burns would have had a daily interface with the truth of slavery, from assisting in purchases through recording punishments and deaths, and an ambitious young man might seek advancement by volunteering to be more hands-on. Now, the publication of Burns's poems to instant acclaim prevented his emigration and that future, but his story demonstrates how slavery permeated every part of Scottish life at that time. We have so much more to do to educate ourselves about the horrors of the past, not least when it has been demonstrated during the pandemic. The legacy of unequal treatment of people of colour is still very much with us today. This year, Black Lives Matter has had a huge impact. In North East Fife, my constituency, a semi-rural constituency, it has been the issue that I and my team have received the most correspondence about. I received many emails and letters on the murder of George Floyd, on the death of Billy Mujinga and the campaign for justice for her, and ensuring that Black history is taught in our schools. I have written to the Scottish Government about making sure that our curriculum is inclusive. And I am concerned that potentially the diverse approach of the Curriculum for Excellence means that for some we won't be teaching that curriculum. So like others in this debate, I absolutely support the work of the Black Curriculum campaign and say that we do need a commitment that every child learns about Britain's role in the slave trade at school. Thank you.
Jonathan Gullis.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I add my name to the long list of other members who have thanked the Honourable Member for Erith and Thamesmead on securing this debate today. And I refer members to my register of interests, as before entering this place, I worked as a secondary school teacher and taught citizenship, history and religious education. Black History Month was always celebrated in every single school I worked in. A variety of specific tutor activities, assemblies and lessons across all subjects were undertaken, and this created a vibrant and inquisitive environment in which students discussed challenging topics. We also taught about, in every school I worked in, the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, ensuring that future generations understand that whilst history can be ugly, it is an opportunity to learn from the past. I've also taught about the apartheid in South Africa and the struggle for freedom and equality led by Nelson Mandela, and still to this day live with the goosebumps when I think of my own visit as a 17-year-old to Robben Island, when we were toured around and heard from the first-hand experiences of our tour guides who had been tragically prisoners on this particular island. I even experienced the racism sadly that exists in South Africa when one of my teammates was chanted out with monkey noises as we played against one of the schools over there, leading us to abandon the game early, and having our school, with our black head rugby coach, being refused entry onto the premises in order to dine with our opposition players. As part of the curriculum, we also looked at Justin Fashanu, the first black footballer to command a transfer fee of £1 million, and also the first professional footballer to come out as openly gay. But there is one individual, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I want to give a special shout out to, a former colleague of mine from Blackfen School for Girls in the London Borough of Bexley, where I started my career. Lola Blatch to this day is the most gifted and inspirational teacher I've ever worked with. In the politics, philosophy and enterprise faculty she ran, we delivered a citizenship curriculum that focused on challenging issues from the past to the present. Whether it was a scheme of work exploring the use of protest music and having students create their own song on a current political issue, to hosting International Evening, where parents and pupils from all different cultural backgrounds would serve food, sing, dance and host a fashion show, celebrating our diversity as a community, remains to this day one of the highlights of my career. What Lola and I also did, however, was challenge students' thoughts and ideas. One of the schemes of work was to look at the murder of Stephen Lawrence. This murder took place not far from the school, and we examined the ways in which Stephen's family was wronged and reminded students what can happen when racism goes unchallenged. The curriculum's flexibility enabled Lola and I to tackle such wide-ranging and difficult topics. The focus of all our lessons was never to solely focus on the colour of someone's skin, but to see a person for who they are. If I may then very briefly turn to the area that I'm proud to serve, which is Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk, because in the mother town of Burslem stands Wedgwood House, a dawning reminder of one of our city's finest, Josiah Wedgwood, who was a prominent slave abolitionist. From 1787 until his death in 1795, Josiah Wedgwood actively participated in the abolition of slavery cause. His slave medallion brought public attention to abolition and was the most famous image of a black person in all of 18th century art. I know that his work on this matter is taught annually in schools across Stoke-on-Trent, Kidsgrove and Talk, and I expect to see it continue forevermore in order to better inform the future generations. Because if we are to truly understand the contribution made from people from a BAME community to our history, then we need to celebrate and share that history as a positive, rather than looking at what seeks to divide. Because when I faced down the BNP and the EDL in the London Borough of Bexley, when the letters came in, having a go for what we were teaching, it was about celebrating what was good and what brought us together, rather than about what divided us, which is what those, the far right, wish to try and seek to create between us.
Yeah. Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also want to start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, on securing this very important debate. I'm proud to represent one of the most diverse constituencies in the country, a constituency with one of the largest Caribbean and African communities in the UK, and a very direct connection to the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948. In 2018, the same year that we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush, many of my constituents also found themselves victims of the Windrush scandal and suffered the terrible, deep emotional pain of rejection by the place they had understood to be their country. It is that experience that reinforced my belief in the urgent need for reform of the history curriculum. The Windrush scandal was caused by the callous policies of a Tory government, but addressing it was harder than it should have been, because far too many people in government and beyond did not have an accurate understanding of British history or as a consequence of Britishness. There was a catastrophic failure to understand that the Windrush generation had come to the UK as British citizens under the 1948 British Nationality Act. Addressing the Windrush scandal was not about regularising the status of Commonwealth citizens who had come to the UK in the decades following the Second World War, but recognising the status as British citizens that they had always had. One of the recommendations made by Wendy Williams in her Lessons Learnt review following the Windrush scandal was that all existing and new staff in the Home Office should learn about the history of the UK and its relationship with the rest of the world, including Britain's colonial history, the history of inward and outward migration, and the history of Black Britons. If such a programme is important for staff in the Home Office, surely it is important for every child being educated in British schools. Understanding that we are a nation of migrants, that every community and every family has a migration story, that every historical event can be seen from a range of different perspectives, and that telling the story of everyone who was there matters. These things help us to find the things we have in common and help to build cohesion. In our divided society, this is more important than ever. Curriculum reform is not difficult. There are brilliant resources readily available, and I would mention in particular our migration story, developed by the Runnymede Trust, Manchester and Cambridge Universities and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Black curriculum and existing GCSE modules by Edexcel and AQA, currently taught to less than 10% of students. And I want to mention the fantastic work by Lambeth Council to improve the attainment of Black students in the borough under the banner Raising the Game, this month distributing Patrick Vernon's brilliant new book, 100 Black Britons, to every school in the borough. Curriculum reform is simply about taking this good practice and ensuring that every child in the UK is able to benefit from it. In the brief time I have available, I want to say a word in support of the Black Cultural Archives, based on Windrush Square in Brixton in my constituency. BCA is the only national organisation dedicated to the collection, preservation and celebration of the history of Black people in the UK. They have an incredible resource and a national remit, yet they are not currently funded directly by DCMS or afforded the status of a national archive. I call on the government to deliver curriculum reform and to fully fund and resource the Black Cultural Archives in their vital work. Black history is British history, and it should be taught and available to everyone all year round.
Yeah. Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, to be number 60 on the list and to get in is quite an achievement, so thank you for that opportunity to do that. Can I first of all thank the Honourable Lady for Erith and Thamesmead for setting the scene, and for some absolutely wonderful contributions from both sides of this chamber, which I've greatly been heartened by. I believe as an Ulster Scot, but I'm very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, as British to the core. I'm more British than, I think it was Margaret Thatcher says, I'm more British than Finchley. So I'm hoping that that will be the case, and we'll know within the next few months of whether that will be the case or not. But the history of members of this great diverse UK, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, at the same time instilling in them that regardless of differences in class, colour or culture, we are unified in our Britishness, which is only enhanced by our differences. Because I believe we are better, not I always say better together, but we are better together. But it's not just that, it's all the cultures coming together to make this great nation, which we have the privilege to be part of. Black history, I believe, is British history. The same as Ulster Scots history is British history. And I want to commend the Honourable Lady, she's not here, the Honourable Lady for Chipping Barnett, who brought an adjournment debate one night on this very issue, and I thought she hit the scene extremely well and set the tone, and there were some wonderful contributions from other members to that. A hero of mine over the years, and that was Martin Luther King. He had some wonderful comments that he made. He was a man of God. He's also a man who had a social conscience. He's a person who spoke up for other people, and that always intrigued me, and it's probably the reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, why Dr. Paisley, who formerly sat in this House, was a person as a young boy in the late 60s and early 70s, that I resonated with him as he spoke up for others. But Martin Luther King said this: "We must judge by the content of character and not the colour of skin," is a lesson I believe that every school should teach, and that every single adult in this place must put into practice. How much those words could be in our hearts of each and every one of us here, and I think that's a message we want to send out from this place tonight. I'm very much a part of a shared history, and I make this as my last comment in relation to this, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very much from a unionist tradition. I'm very much from an Orange culture. I belong to all of the loyalist organisations, the Orange Institution, the Royal Black Preceptor and the Apprentice Boys. But at school, whenever in the late 60s and early 70s, one of the teachers in my class says, "Would you like to learn Irish history?" Well, the response from the class was, "Yes, we did." Now, it didn't change me, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a unionist. Never was going to, because I'm a deep unionist through and through. It's in every core of my body. But it did give me a perspective of another history, which is important to have that history. And it's important to know about the Irish part of history that we have in our Ireland. So when it comes to the celebration of the 12th of July, for me, it's not designed to detract from any other cultures. Celebration of Black History Month is the opportunity to be grateful for the tremendous achievements of this section of the British people, the Windrush generation we've all referred to, who have done so much to bring the UK to where it is together. That Black history is as much my history, and I want to say that and put that on record. So when we see the Black history coming, I see it as British history, along with my history as an Ulster Scot. And I hope today that this debate will enable us all across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland recognise we are different, but we're also the same. And we're also the same, not just the way we breathe and the blood we have in our bodies, but we're the same because we're British. Thank you.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, for skewing what's been such a rich debate. Celebrating and raising awareness of Black history through Black History Month has been shown to be urgently necessary in the light of the growing anger of our Black community expressed through Black Lives Matter and how the government is approaching our own history on slavery and reparations. We need the government to be an honest broker in our history, neither attempt to whitewash history or belittle the oppression of Black communities in the Americas or Africa. We are unfortunately seeing the opposite in our cultural institutions. The Museum of the Home formerly the Jeffrey Museum in Hackney. It's named after Sir Robert Jeffrey, a slave trader. The museum has a statue of Jeffrey, and after consultation there was a very strong feeling the statue should be removed. The decision should be one entirely made by the museum, who have curatorial freedom and a responsibility to listen to the local community. However, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport decided to intervene in the decision by writing to all museums with arm's length bodies arrangements. The letter did seem particularly aimed at the Museum of the Home and was quite extraordinary in its tone and overreach. The Secretary of State said in the letter, "Statues and other historical objects were created by generations with different perspectives and understandings of right and wrong. I'm not sure there are many people who see the enslavement of others as a matter of perspective or understanding of right and wrong." The Secretary of State went on to say, "It is for this reason that the government does not support the removal of statues or other similar objects." Then comes the implied threat to funding. As set out in your management agreements, I'd expect arm's length bodies' approach to the issues of contested heritage to be consistent with the government's position. This is especially important as we enter a challenging comprehensive spending review, which all government spending will be scrutinised. At the Select Committee, the Museum Director, Sonia Solikari, said the letter was something the board took very seriously. The DCMS is a major stakeholder for us, so we took that on board in the decision-making process. Local people in Hackney were appalled. I spoke to Jermaine Jackman today, who is chair of the Hackney Young Futures Commission. He told me when the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol was pulled down, the government called the protest out for not allowing the democratic process. However, Hackney allowed and followed a democratic process consulting the local community, which is overwhelming in favour of having it removed. However, the government put pressure on the board and ignored the will of the people. Jermaine is correct, and DCMS are moving the goalposts, and to whose detriment? The Museums Association, in their statement, put it best. The letter is the latest in a series of interventions from the Culture Secretary that has led to fears the government is undermining the sector's independence. Not my words, theirs. I'd also like to talk about an episode of Black history that sadly is rarely taught in our academic institutions or schools, and that is the oppression and genocide of the West Papuans under Indonesian occupation. As chair of the West Papuan APBG, it's incumbent on me to add their struggle to those of so many black and indigenous ones around the world. This year, following the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, the West Papuans found inspiration to link their own struggle with them, under the slogan, Papuan Lives Matter. The campaign has shed light on Indonesia's institutional racism against West Papuans. For instance, in August 2019, Papuan students were attacked in Indonesia's second largest city and called monkeys. The police then rounded up the students, firing tear gas into their dormitory. In 2006 in Jaipura, everyone who had dreadlocks was arrested and their hair was cut. This continued for a fortnight. The Jakarta Post last year discussed one Papuan living in Yogyakarta and said not unusual for landlords to express their approval of rent applications by phone, only to reject them once they found out where they were from. These and many other instances of racism, I'm sure, chime with many of my colleagues in the chamber, and how many black communities in the UK were treated in the past. West Papuans leaders have sought political asylum around the world, including Benny Wender, the chair of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua. He's a brilliant exponent for his people and needs to be platformed much more here in the UK where he lives, so light can be shone on what's happening to West Papuan people. I'd like to finally thank my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, for securing this opportunity, so I can add my voice to the many black colleagues in the chamber who I'm honoured to serve alongside. Thank you.
Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Erith and Thamesmead on getting this debate, and I've had a number of messages from my colleagues on the SNP benches asking me to also pass it on. She said she came to this place to speak for those who barely get a mention, and I want her to know that it hasn't gone unnoticed, and I know that it will mean so much to the people she's referring to. Sometimes even if you're not able to change things immediately for people, just knowing that you're there fighting their corner makes a difference. Better to change them, obviously. I want to say something about the what, the why and the who of Black History Month. So what does Black History Month mean to me? To me, it's something that, much as I love it, I wish it didn't have to happen. And if we incorporated Black history into the teaching of our past, not just in schools, but generally, and decolonised that teaching, perhaps Black History Month would be redundant. But we haven't, and until we do, Black History Month is essential. There have been really good speeches on both sides of the House today, and I think sometimes on the government benches they've been a little bit sensitive, but they shouldn't be, because the fault lies with all of us. It's just about being honest in our teaching. Our stories are told from one perspective, the perspective of the colonisers. But how did it look from the perspective of the colonised? The missing perspectives is what decolonising the teaching of history is all about. In addition to that, what about the black historical figures who get nothing like the attention equivalent white figures get? We should not pick and choose like that. And one of the very best examples I can provide is Florence Nightingale
and Mary Seacole, who has been mentioned multiple times to my delight today. Both should have been taught about, and I would argue that Scots-Jamaican Mary Seacole had more reason for us to learn about her, because everything she did, she had to make it happen. She had to fundraise, as we've heard earlier, to get to the Crimean. She had to fundraise to set up her hospital. It can't have been easy in those days. I'm pretty sure our teachers are expected to teach about leadership, resilience, entrepreneurship, and Mary Seacole did an equivalent thing to Florence Nightingale in a different way and exemplifies all of those things that I've just mentioned. But for hundreds of years we didn't learn about her, did we? So it's about choosing not to be selective in whose incredible achievements we recognise, and it's about choosing not to tell our stories from the perspective of the coloniser only. So why? Why is it so important? Because until we change, the idea that seeps into a child's subconscious is that the world was built and developed by white people. It seeps in because you're sitting in class or reading a book or watching TV and learning about the wonderful women who nursed those soldiers, the great inventors, the artists, the poets, the scholars, the writers, the philosophers. You see these incredible people and they're all white, but they weren't all white. Those children may not be sitting consciously thinking, all the great people are white, but as I said, it seeps in. For the black child, they're in danger of growing up believing on some level that the white people of the world must be cleverer, more talented, more relevant. And for the white child, how can they possibly avoid growing up believing on some level that it must be true, and that white people, having built the world all by themselves, must be somehow superior? And here is the why. Racism is rooted in untruthful or selective teaching about our past. People are not born racist. They learn it. Like the Honourable Member for Brent North, I often hear people saying, I don't see skin colour. And I know what they're trying to say, but yes, you do. Young children, however, don't seem to notice skin colour any more than they see eye colour or hair colour. They learn to be racist. We, as a society, collectively, we teach them to be racist. But if black children and white children learn about the world from the perspective of all ethnicities, and they see and hear about the people of all ethnicities who've made their contribution to developing our world, if what seeps into their psyche is more truthful, we won't stop racism, but I'm convinced we will reduce it. So on to the who. Who am I talking about? Well, I don't have time to list everyone I want to, so instead I'm going to table a series of EDMs till the end of October featuring a different figure in Black history each time. I've started already, and I'd invite friends across the House to join me in doing it. But I do want to talk about one person in particular, and that is Andrew Watson, a Scots Guyanan who was the first black professional footballer on these islands. He was also an engineer, so a high achiever. His highest achiever, however, spoken like a true engineer, his highest achievement, however, was that he played for the Scotland football team on 3 occasions, captaining the side in his first match. Most importantly, Scotland won each game. The consensus and smiles may disappear in a moment when I tell the Chamber that the first of those matches was played at the Oval in Kennington, and he led his team to a 6-1 victory over England. The next match, I'm sorry I can't include you in this, the next match we beat Wales 5-1, and his final international we beat England again, but sadly that time it was only 5-1. But that's really why he's my hero. But I knew nothing about this man until about 10 years ago. There were efforts to get him recognised, and indeed my friend, the Honourable Member for Argyll and Bute, once made a documentary about Andrew Watson. He did it in conjunction with celebrated broadcaster and journalist, my friend and constituent, Stuart Cosgrove, who's also an author. And as an aside, his latest book is about Cassius Clay. Andrew Watson is now memorialised in the Hall of Fame at Scotland's National Stadium in Hampden. But why do special efforts and campaigns have to happen for people to be recognised? As the Honourable Member for Vauxhall explained, it took 12 years to get the statue of Mary Seacole. Madam Deputy Speaker, do you know that 80,000 people lined the banks of the Thames to celebrate Mary Seacole when she returned from the Crimean War? How on earth did we manage to whitewash her out of history until recently? Why did it take a campaign to recognise her? Madam Deputy Speaker, most people do not wish to be racist. I believe most of it is simply down to not knowing or not understanding. And part of our job in here is to help them. And I'd like to invite members to join the APPG on unconscious bias, of which I'm co-chair along with my friend, the Honourable Member for Brent North, who gave a brilliant speech today and who tolerated the nonsense from the other side of the House earlier on extremely well. Our first investigation is into unconscious racial bias, and we'll be having a public launch shortly, and I'll email round about it. And yes, progress has been made. It's just not enough progress. But I will share one story on that. My 17-year-old goddaughter, Tonian, texted me yesterday saying, I'm in class and I'm watching Uncle Graham on TV. Tonian's mum is white Scottish and her dad is black Jamaican. The Uncle Graham in question is my partner, who was featured in a BBC documentary made by Stuart Chisamiri. And it's called Black and Scottish. It's on iPlayer. Please watch it. It's absolutely brilliant. Here's a child of Scots-Jamaican descent seeing black role models featured in her education, and she was absolutely delighted. The icing on the cake was that she happened to be related to one of them. Earlier we heard the Right Honourable Member for Islington North note the decision by Glasgow University to make reparation for the way in which they benefited from the Caribbean slave trade. Is somebody trying to come in? Am I allowed? I certainly will.
Be brief. I'm fascinated by this APPG on, it's making a fantastic speech. I'm fascinated by this APPG on unconscious bias because, and I wonder, could her first inquiry be into the unconscious bias of the SNP against the English?
Well, maybe, Madam Deputy Speaker, we'll just change it. I'll need to speak to the Honourable Member for Brent North, but maybe we'll just change it to the conscious bias of the SNP against the Tories. So, did I hear Conservatives saying hear, hear? Thank you. Yes, so we heard... So, I've lost my place now. So, Glasgow University, the reparations that they are making for the way in which they benefited from the slave trade. It was the aforementioned Uncle Graham, in his role as chair of Flag Up Scotland Jamaica, of which I'm a board member, who approached Glasgow University suggesting they do this. And it's a lesson in life that if you don't ask, you don't get. The university, to its credit, agreed almost immediately. Secured the services of historian Dr. Stephen Mullen, did their sums and set about a fantastic reparation programme that's about much, much more than just the money. I want to end by saying something about tolerance. I've heard too many people in this place today talk about racial tolerance, about how Britain is tolerant, and I want to gently but firmly urge them to be careful about the use of that word, or be prepared to explain who exactly we are tolerating and what exactly they do that requires tolerance. Language really matters, and we should all, including myself, be ready to examine our own.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and let me start by saying I'm truly honoured to be closing this debate for the official opposition. And I want to begin by congratulating my friend, the Honourable Member for Erith and Thamesmead, for securing this important debate, and a thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. Members have heard today that this is the first debate on Black History Month for 5 years in this House. And I do hope we do not have to wait another 5 years before we have another debate, because this House should always have time to consider and debate issues of such great importance. Today we have heard speeches and contributions from dozens of honourable and right honourable members across this House, all of which has been done in the most part good-natured. There were a few parts not so. So many members have shared their stories from their own communities, including my honourable friend, who's not in her place, the member for Hampstead, who talked about Dr. Pip, who first stood for Labour in the 1950s in that election and was the second black person to become a Lord, or my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, who gave a powerful opening speech about the importance of Black History Month and why we need to celebrate it, and my honourable friend for Luton South, who shared her experiences growing up in the 80s and the education she had, and citing Mary Seacole, who many have cited in this debate today. Black History Month has been celebrated every year in the UK since 1987. That was also a historic year, as that year we elected the first free black MPs to this place. The late Bernie Grant, Paul Boateng, and the Right Honourable Member for Hackney and Stoke Newington. In Black History Month, we aim to highlight and celebrate the contributions of black people who may not be part of the black history or our curriculum. And this Black History Month is even more important as we face the global health pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, which has shone a light on some of those structural racial inequalities experienced by Black people here in the UK and across the world. The tragic murder of George Floyd by white police officers in the United States ignited a global show of solidarity through the Black Lives Matter protests. Thousands of people from different backgrounds came together to demand fundamental change and challenge the racial injustices in Britain today. Racism is a systemic problem and does require systemic solutions. And as my honourable friend for Streatham says, it is not enough to merely say you are not racist. It is to be an anti-racist. And it starts with knowing our history, as so many honourable members have said across this House today. Like my honourable friend from Leighton and Wanstead, who gave us such a great history of the Caribbean politics and sport in telling us all about the great Michael Manley, the Jamaican Prime Minister. And my honourable friend from, my right honourable friend, the member for Islington North, who cited the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the fight of those enslaved who fought for freedom. And he rightly cited those injustices and those disparities that exist. So we celebrate our history and be proud of our history. As many have said throughout this debate today, Black history is British history. Proud of people like the abolitionist Mary Prince, who has been cited, who wrote the first Black woman to write this book, published in 1831, or the first Pan-African conference that took place just down the road here in Westminster Town Hall in 1900, which was attended by people from Africa, the West Indies, the US, also included the attendance of John Archer, who I shall come on to shortly. But I want us all to know about the thousands and thousands of Black people who fought for our country in the First World War and succeeding wars, including the men who served in the British West Indies Regiment in 1915. The Windrush generation, who made such great contributions to our society. Many of them were among the first to work in the NHS, including members of my own family. And in the 1960s, we had Paul Stevenson, alongside Ray Hackett, Guy Bailey, and many others, that challenged the racism and discrimination and led the Bristol bus boycott, which lasted 4 months until the company backed down and overturned the colour bar. These are all part of our history, our British history. The boycott helped to influence the passing of the first Race Relations Act of 65, 68 and 76, all passed by a Labour government, of course. And we will never forget the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 and the institutional racism which surrounded the investigation and led to our friend Baroness Lawrence and her family's long fight for justice. Whether we know it or not, we are all affected by those that have gone before us. I myself am proud to stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before me, including some of those greats that represented Battersea, such as John Archer, who, when elected Mayor of Battersea in 1913, became the first Black Mayor of London and rightly cited that his election was a pivotal moment. And one of the first Asian MPs elected in Battersea again in 1922, Shapraji Saklakvala. I do stand on the shoulders of many greats. But we all need to know and to be able to talk about Britain's colonial past and structural racism that continues to exist. Whilst we know we have made progress, we still have some way to go. As cited by many this afternoon, Black workers with degrees still earn around 23% less than their white workers. We know that Black Caribbean children are still 3 times more likely to be excluded from school. And we also know that Black men are more than 9 times likely to be stopped and searched. And we know that many are still disproportionately dying in police custody. Acknowledging and understanding this matters. And that is why the Wendy Williams Windrush Lessons Learned Review itself made clear. The Windrush scandal was in part able to happen because of the public's poor understanding of Britain's colonial history of inward and outward migration, and history of Black Britons. So we need to learn, and we also need to ensure we create more justice. Justice for the thousands of people from the Windrush generation, many of whom lost their homes, their livelihoods, and in some cases, tragically, their lives. We need justice for the black people whose deaths could have been avoided during this pandemic. And we need actions to address the hugely disproportionate impact that coronavirus is still having on our black, Asian and minority ethnic communities right now. But this government has so far failed to implement many of the recommendations that Public Health England has made. The countless families who have lost loved ones and their communities should not have to wait any longer. And that is why Labour has called on the need for a race equality strategy that takes lessons from the COVID-19 virus pandemic and seeks to fundamentally change the systems and institutions where these structural racial inequalities exist. So today I will ask the Minister, and I call on the Minister, to say that she will urgently look to implement a race equality strategy. A strategy which includes fundamental reform to the national curriculum, as cited by so many honourable friends, including the members for Ilford North, Vauxhall, Streatham, Brent Central, Newcastle Central, Cynon Valley, Dulwich and West Norwood, Luton South, Coventry North West, Stockport and so many others, so that it includes an honest account of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade. Will the Minister not just commit to a review to look into the curriculum? A strategy which addresses some of those racial disparities, like mentioned by my honourable member for Romsey and Southampton, and I will hold her select committee to account to ensure that we start to see the mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting. A strategy which seeks to implement the many, many recommendations that have already been set out on racial inequalities, whether that's the McGregor-Smith review, the Lammy review, Wendy Williams' lessons learned review, and countless many others. A strategy that really seeks to recognise all of our different ethnicities within black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. There is so much more that this government can do and should do. The time is now to act. So as I conclude, this is why we continue to celebrate Black History Month, and we will continue to celebrate Black history because, as Marcus Garvey says, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree with no roots. We all, each of us in this House, has a role to play, to stand for and demand that change. Black history is British history.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be standing here at the dispatch box to close this much-needed debate on Black History Month, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Erith and Thamesmead, who's managed to be both a frontbencher and a backbencher today. It's quite a feat. And also the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate and giving me an opportunity to speak on an issue that's very close to my heart. And also thank you to all those honourable and right honourable members who have made thoughtful contributions. I will speak as quickly as I can, and I'm afraid I won't be able to reference every speech, but I think that this has been a fantastic debate. This year, more than it has been for decades, race has been at the heart of our national conversation. Black History Month remains an opportunity to shine a light upon those whose contributions to our national history deserves to be better known. This month, the government has taken the opportunity to celebrate the contribution of Black Britons who enrich our collective national life and form an inseparable part of our national history. Women like Yvonne Connolly, who in 1969 became the UK's first black female head teacher. Throughout her 40-year career, she has inspired and mentored generations of educators. Mr. Speaker, the work of Ms. Connolly and her fellow heads is key in the topic we are debating. Education is the key to our mission as a government to level up and spread opportunity to everyone, whatever their background. Many members have said they want more Black history taught, but they don't seem to be aware of what is actually on the curriculum. Our curriculum is not the curriculum of 50, 40, or even 20 years ago. Children today are able to learn about the British Empire and colonialism, about the transatlantic slave trade and its abolition, and of how our history has been shaped by people of all ethnicities, as well as having the opportunity to study non-European cultures such as Mughal India or the Benin Empire, which is where my ancestors decided to have their own opportunity to take over the world in their own way. Pupils Pupils can currently study migration, empires and the people in the AQA History GCSE, for example. The member for Ilford North is quite wrong to say that that's the only place that it can be learned. There are many other exam bodies that do offer this. But our curriculum does not need decolonizing for the simple reason that it is not colonized. We should not apologize for the fact that British children primarily study the history of these islands. And it goes without saying that the recent fad to decolonize maths, decolonize engineering, decolonize the sciences that we have seen across our universities to make race the defining principle of what is studied is not just misguided, but actively opposed to the fundamental purpose of education. The curriculum, by its very nature, is limited. There are a finite number of hours to teach any subject, and what we haven't heard in this debate from those members who want more added to it on both sides of the House is what necessarily must be taken out. Perhaps we'll get to that on another day. Members such as the member for Islington North and many others have raised the Black Lives Matter movement. The member for Streatham raised the education guidance and believes that we're trying to stop children from becoming activists. I believe another member, apologies, I've forgotten who it was who mentioned it. However, what we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted fact. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life, and it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be absolutely clear, this government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Some schools have decided to openly support the anti-capitalist Black Lives Matter group, often fully aware that they have a statutory duty to be politically impartial. Black lives do matter, of course they do, but we know that the Black Lives Matter movement, capital BLM, is political. I know this because at the height of the protest, I saw white Black Lives, well, I've been told of white Black Lives Matter protesters calling, and I'm afraid I apologize for saying this word, calling a black armed police officer guarding Downing Street a pet nigger. That is why we do not endorse that movement on this side of the House. It is a political movement, and what would be nice would be for members on the opposite side to condemn many of the actions that we see this political movement instead of pretending that it is a completely wholesome anti-racist organization. There is a lot of pernicious stuff that is being pushed, and we stand against that. We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt. And let me be clear, any school which teaches these elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views, is breaking the law. Members have mentioned the police. Our history is our own, it's not America's. Too often, those who campaign against racial inequality import wholesale a narrative and assumptions that have nothing to do with this country's history and have no place on these islands. Our police force is not their police force. Since its establishment by Robert Peel, our police have operated on the principle of policing by consent, and it gives me tremendous pride to still, in 2020, live in a nation where the vast majority of our police officers are unharmed. On the history of black people in Britain, again, our history of race is not America's history of race. Most black British people who have come to our shores were not brought here in chains, but came voluntarily, due to their connections to the UK and in search of a better life. I should know I am one of them. And we have our own joys and sorrows to tell. From the Windrush generation to the Somali diaspora, it is a story that is uniquely ours. And if we forget that story, to replace it with an imported, Americanized narrative of slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow, we erase not only the history of Black Britain, but the history of every other community that has contributed to this society and has also been a victim of racism or discrimination, from the Pakistani community to the Jewish community. On delivering a race equality strategy, I've listened to members opposite talk about a race equality strategy. They know that this government has set up a commission on race and ethnic disparities, but they have not engaged with it. They don't want a race equality strategy. What they want is for the government to adopt their race equality strategy, and that's not what we're doing. Mr. Speaker, we won an election just a year ago. I'm afraid I don't have enough time to give way. Mr. Speaker, we won an election a year ago. If members on the other side want to implement their race equality strategy, they should go ahead and win an election, win the support of the British people, and then they can have their way. But at the moment, this is a Conservative government, and we are going to do this in the way that we believe the people of this country want. I'm afraid I'm not giving way. I've only got 3 minutes, and I have more than 3 minutes of context, of content. Mr. Speaker, in her speech, the member for Brent Central says she hoped I'd learn something from her. Now it's time for me to give her a couple of lessons too, although I don't believe she's in her place. She said in her speech, we need to look at history and we need to improve it. Lesson number 1, you cannot improve history, you can only learn from it. What we can improve is the future, and that is what this government has been doing over the last 10 years. I won't reel out statistics in the interest of time. Other members on this side of the House have already done so. Lesson number 2. Black history is not the history of institutional racism. Listening to some members across the House, it's quite clear that they don't know the difference. It is not true, as the member for Liverpool Riverside said, that African history was interrupted by slavery. Also shows an ignorance of geography, because West African history is different from African history. As probably the only member of this House who actually grew up and went to school in Africa, I can tell you that's not what we're taught. Much more is taught about the history of black slave traders who existed before and after the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, the most notable statue in the city of Lagos, where I grew up, is that of Madam Tinubu. It's the biggest one. It's now equivalent of Trafalgar Square. She was a slave trader, but she was also a freedom fighter and a much-loved icon. Her slave trading is not celebrated, but her fight against colonizers is. In Nigeria, she's recognized as a complex character, as all historical figures are, and heaven help anyone who would try to pull her statue down. There is much that we can learn from Nigeria about how to handle the issue of statues. But why does this issue mean so much to me, Mr. Speaker? It's not just because I'm a first-generation immigrant. It's because my daughter came home from school this month and said to me, we're learning Black History Month because every other month is about white history. This is wrong, and this is not what our children should be picking up. These are not the values I have taught her. They are instead yet another sign of the pernicious identity politics that looks at individuals primarily as groups of biological characteristics. People often don't realize when it has taken hold, and I know that many of them are well-meaning. But what I really want to finish with is the story of Tom Molyneux. He was a black boxer who freed himself from slavery in the US, and he moved to England in 1809. I would have said so much more, but I'm out of time, Mr. Speaker. But what his story tells us is that this is a country that welcomes people, and that black people from all over the world have found this to be a great and welcoming country. These are the values as a black woman I'm teaching my black daughter. We must never take it for granted. And this Black History Month, let us celebrate the black talent we are blessed with, the progress we have made in accepting one another, and the contribution black people have made in making us who we are as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Backbench Committee again and all members of this House for contributing to this debate. This has been a very engaging debate, and I hope this continues. I want to also thank members of the public that responded to my call in terms of what I should discuss at this debate. I've met so many people that have been engaged. I also want to thank members of the public for recommending trailblazers for me to mention in this House today. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to mention everyone. There are just so many trailblazers out there, and we just need to learn all about them. I also want to say that I want to emphasise again that we really do need to have a race equality strategy and an action plan. And second, to diversify the curriculum. We must listen to members of the public. So many people have signed that petition asking us to diversify the curriculum. This is not about political point scoring. This is about listening to members of the public about what their needs are and looking at the stats that have been put out there. There's been loads of research that have been poured out by teachers asking for the curriculum to be diversified. I also want to say this is not also about identity politics. This is about understanding the true history of our nation in the UK, because we can only move forward if we learn the good, the ugly side of the politics. This isn't about glossing politics and making it pretty. This is not about attacking white people or attacking anyone because of their politics. This is about learning our true history, because it's absolutely important that we understand that to be able to move forward in progress.
Order, order. I'm going to put the question because I think it's right. The House should put the question, but I technically should have done it, so I'm going to still put it. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those passive in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order, order. Before the Secretary of State for Health, Social Care addresses the Chamber, could I just point out that British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. I now call the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, to make a statement. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I'd like to make a statement on coronavirus. The virus remains a perilous threat. Yesterday, Europe recorded its 7 millionth coronavirus case. Deaths in Germany and Italy have doubled in 7 days. And here, today's ONS statistics show that weekly deaths linked to coronavirus have risen to their highest level since the start of July. Cases among the over 60s continue to rise. And as Deputy Chief Medical Officer Jonathan Van Tam made clear earlier, it is the penetration of coronavirus into older age groups which gives the NHS the greatest cause for concern. So we must act where the virus is spreading. In the parts of the country where it's spreading the fastest, it is our sombre duty to take action necessary to protect people's lives and protect the NHS. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus is not a short-term problem that can easily be fixed. It requires difficult decisions in these difficult times. Our goal is to get life back to as normal as possible, support the NHS, keep children at school, and shelter the economy as much as possible, and do this by suppressing the virus until a vaccine is available. It's been clear for some days now that further action is needed across parts of England. Last Monday, we were able to reach an agreement with the leadership of Liverpool City Region across party lines to take the action that's needed, with a package of financial support and cooperation. Yesterday, I announced to the House a similar agreement reached in Lancashire. In Lancashire, Liverpool and across the country, we continue to work closely with local leadership. Mr. Speaker, in Greater Manchester, there have been more coronavirus infections already in October than in July, August and September combined. The average daily hospital admissions in Greater Manchester are now higher than they were on the 26th of March. And there are now more COVID-19 patients in Greater Manchester hospitals than in the whole of the South West and South East combined. As a result, we need to take further action to protect lives and livelihoods in Greater Manchester. So, informed by this data, we've made the difficult decision to place Greater Manchester into the very high local COVID alert level, coming into force at 1 minute past midnight on Friday. This means that pubs and bars must close unless they're serving substantial meals. Households cannot mix indoors or in most outdoor settings. In some public outdoor spaces, groups must be limited to the rule of 6, and we strongly advise against travel into and out of the area. In line with the extra measures taken in Lancashire, casinos, bingo halls, betting shops, adult gaming centres and soft play areas must also close. Now, I know that these restrictions are tough, and so we're putting in place a comprehensive package of support. This includes the Job Support Scheme, which ensures those affected by business closures are still paid. Once topped up with universal credit, those on low incomes will receive at least 70% of their normal income. 80%, I apologise, of their normal income. We've also made available up to £465 million to help local authorities implement and enforce restrictions. Greater Manchester will receive £22 million of this. And we will also work with local authorities to allocate testing and introduce local contact tracing. Over the last 10 days, we've sought to reach an agreement with local leaders. And unfortunately, we were not able to reach an agreement in Greater Manchester as we have previously in Lancashire and the Liverpool City region. As well as the support that I've outlined, we've made a generous and extensive offer to support Manchester's businesses. This offer was proportionate to the support that we've given the Liverpool City region and Lancashire, but regrettably, the Mayor rejected it. Of course, we do not want businesses in Greater Manchester to be disadvantaged, so that offer remains on the table. Our door is open to further discussions with local leaders in the coming days about business support. Mr. Speaker, I understand the impact of these measures, but we must take the decisions to save lives and ultimately livelihoods in Greater Manchester. And to everyone in Greater Manchester, I say this: throughout these difficult times for your great city, we will be by your side. And the best thing all of us can do now to protect our loved ones and to get back to normal as fast as possible is for everyone to come together to follow these new rules and for all to play their part in tackling this deadly virus. Mr. Speaker, the path through a pandemic is never straightforward. It requires all of us to make difficult decisions and tough sacrifices and to get the virus under control. I know that these local restrictions are hard and they're another sacrifice in a year full of sacrifices. But we must not waver now. We must persevere as we work so hard on the long-term solutions that will see us through and come together once again so we can look after the people and the communities that we love. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State, Jonathan Ashworth.
Well, as always, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, but I'm afraid that tonight, people across Manchester and the boroughs of Greater Manchester and towns like Stockport and Leigh and Bury, where I grew up, will be watching the news in disbelief, and they will be worried if they are affected by these closures. And they will be asking, why was it right to cover 80% of wages in March and then now, in the run-up to Christmas, cover just 2/3 of their wages in October? What happened to that Chancellor who plastered across social media soft-focused selfies of himself, boasting that he would support jobs and incomes and do whatever it takes? Because tonight, that Chancellor is forcing people on the national minimum wage to live on just £5.76 an hour, from whatever it takes to now taking from the lowest paid. How does he expect families to pay the bills, to pay the rent, to put food on the table, to pay for the school lunches, when 1/3 of their income has been snatched away literally overnight? And where is the Chancellor? He should be here to defend the consequences of his decisions that will mean a winter of hardship across the north. Now, I grew up in Greater Manchester. My dad worked in casinos in Salford. My mum worked in bars in Manchester. I know that across Manchester, people will want to do the right thing, but they won't be able to if 1/3 of their income is stripped away. Now, the leaders of Greater Manchester were prepared to compromise. They offered to settle for £65 million to support jobs and livelihoods. The government insisted on £60 million. But rather than finding the £5 million extra, the Prime Minister pulled the plug on negotiations and then this afternoon took £38 million off the table. What a petty, vindictive, callous response in a national crisis, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may think he's punishing the politicians. In fact, he's punishing the people of Greater Manchester, Mr. Speaker. And this is the Prime Minister who has blown £150 million on face masks that weren't suitable for frontline NHS staff. He's blown £130 million on testing kits that turned out to be unsafe and had to be recalled. And he's spending £7,000 a day on consultants as part of his failing £12 billion test and trace programme. Now, given test and trace is broken and the virus is out of control, I've always accepted that greater containment measures are needed. But for measures to be effective, they need to command the consent of the people impacted. And people need to know how long these measures will last. The Secretary of State didn't tell us in his statement just now. And yet these restrictions also have been called into question by the Chief Medical Officer, who said they won't be enough. And these are restrictions that the Prime Minister admitted last week gives us only, in his words, a chance to bring the national R down. So how will the sacrifices the Prime Minister is forcing upon the people in the north bring down infection rates in the south? Because he knows to bring R below 1, further measures will be needed. He knows more areas are likely to go into Tier 3. This is about so much more than Greater Manchester. But people will watch tonight and say if a government is prepared to inflict this level of harm on its people in the middle of a pandemic in one part of the country, then they will be prepared to do it to people in all parts of the country as well. And the result will be a winter of hardship for millions of people. This isn't a game. It's about people's lives. People need proper financial support. This is a national crisis, and we won't defeat this virus on the cheap.
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I regret that the honourable member, who so often is so reasonable, is choosing to play political games with political rhetoric tonight. As I said in my statement, the offer of the support is on the table. And to the people of Greater Manchester, I say that the offer of the same support that was agreed with the Labour leadership of the Liverpool City region, and I commend them for their work, and was agreed with the leadership of Lancashire, and I commend them for their work, the same offer is on the table and remains on the table. And I look forward in the coming days to working with the local councils right across Greater Manchester, and of course the Mayor, if he's willing to come back to the table, to make sure that we have that package of support for businesses in place. But crucially, it is incumbent on us all to send the same public health messages to our constituents wherever we represent around the country, but in particular in the areas where cases are rising, as in Greater Manchester, to make sure that we are clear about the part everybody needs to play to keep this virus under control. And it is that sort of public health messaging, rather than political games, that I think the public is looking for in these difficult times.
Back to the House, Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say the opposition leader has been moderate. He hasn't repeated his party leader's call for a national lockdown, and people in the areas where the virus has not jumped up very high will be grateful for that. My father's family came from Greater Manchester. Were they there now, I think they'd ask that the Mayor should actually make an agreement with the government, because public help and public health go together. And if it is a proportionate offer, we haven't heard the reason why it's inadequate in one place. If we want to have employment in the future, we need to have employers, and getting help to those who need to keep their businesses going, struggling to keep their businesses going, that help is going to be needed. Can I just make one point to my right honourable friend? Down in Worthing, we're not getting our test results back all the time very fast. It's important we do. So if, for example, a child may have symptoms, a father or mother may not be able to go to work as a teacher, and you end up by penalising all the children in a class, and I hope my right honourable friend will be able to say what's happening.
Well, I strongly agree with my honourable friend, who puts it very clearly that the people of Greater Manchester would expect their local leaders to come to the table, and that offer remains there. It remains there for the support for local businesses, alongside the support for strengthening test and trace and strengthening enforcement in Greater Manchester. And I would urge all of the leaders of the 9 boroughs of Greater Manchester to pick up the phone and to work with us to make sure that we can deliver this. And of course that offer remains open for the Mayor if he wants to return to the table. On the point about the testing in Worthing, I will absolutely look into whether there was a specific problem. The test turnaround times have come down as the capacity has rapidly expanded, and I will make sure that I get back to my right honourable friend as soon as possible.
Let's head to Scotland, the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford. Dr. Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While there may be a small minority who do not think of those around them, the majority of people try to follow the advice to reduce the spread of COVID. We know the virus spreads where people are in close contact. This isn't just pubs and nightclubs, but includes those in overcrowded housing or those who are working in exposed jobs where working from home isn't an option, or those on 0 hours contracts where if they aren't working, they simply won't get paid. Does the Secretary of State not think it's a bit inappropriate for politicians with well-paid and secure jobs to suggest that rising COVID cases in certain areas are just due to some form of misbehaviour requiring tougher penalties? People want to do the right thing, whether due to restrictions or because they are infected themselves, but sometimes they feel they've no option but to continue going out of the house. While in general surveys, the vast majority of people say they would isolate if they caught COVID, a study from King's College London shows that less than 20% of those who actually develop symptoms go on to isolate. This was associated with financial hardship, social deprivation, having dependent children, and working in key jobs which can't be carried out from home. Why is the Chancellor not continuing the full furlough scheme when we are heading into a second wave and the hardest winter the NHS will ever have faced? There are still millions of people who've not received any support since March. Does the Secretary of State not recognise that for those on low wages and in insecure work, the choice between staying at home or feeding their family just doesn't feel like a choice at all?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Honourable Lady that the majority of people try to follow the advice, and the vast majority of people want to do the right thing. And we introduced the £500 payment for those on low incomes precisely to support people to do that. We introduced it right across the UK, working with the Scottish Government. And there are signs that the uptake of that has allowed people to complete isolation when they need to in order to keep others safe.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend and his department has engaged with me and my Tees Valley colleagues a number of times in recent weeks, and I thank him for that. He is well aware of my deep reservations about further restrictions on my constituents' lives, liberties and livelihoods, particularly due to the mental health impact that these restrictions present. Can he confirm that while discussions are ongoing, there are no current plans to move Redcar and Cleveland into Tier 3 restrictions? And will he also commit to working with me, Redcar and Cleveland Council, my Tees Valley colleagues and the Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchin on any future changes we make?
Yes, we've been working very closely with the Tees Valley, and the need for the level 2 restrictions there was not something that we put into place lightly, but we followed the data, and we will continue to follow the data and take the action that's needed, but only the action that's needed, and engage absolutely with my honourable friend, the Mayor of the Tees Valley, who is rising above party politics to do the right thing for the Tees Valley. The point that I would make to him, though, in addition to the points that he made, is that the impact, for instance, on mental health is undoubtedly worse if the virus gets out of control, even though the measures that are taken are difficult ones. And the Royal College of Psychiatry has been very clear that the best thing for mental health is for us to keep the virus under control, even though, of course, we need to mitigate the consequences that do and do flow from the measures that we sometimes have to take.
Today marks a low point in the handling of this situation, where instead of uniting people behind its approach, the government has imposed its decision, leaving a bitter taste. And there are other decisions still to come, and other regions who are watching what has happened today, including my own in the West Midlands. So can the Secretary of State assure the House that as significant economic support is withdrawn at the end of this month, any decision on whether or not national restrictions are required will not be taken because it's cheaper and a means of avoiding adequate support for businesses and workers concerned? Because if that is the case, then the public health measures and the economic measures will be pulling in two different directions.
Yes, absolutely. And the extra support that we put into areas that go into Tier 3 is a reflection of the need to ensure that that support is there when action has to be taken for public health reasons in order to control the virus. I spoke to the Mayor of the West Midlands just before coming into this chamber, and we will work very closely together to make sure that we keep the virus under control in the West Midlands, where in a very large part the local leadership, again across party lines, has worked very closely together to do what is right for the people of the West Midlands.
Today, Jonathan Van Tam, in answer to a question, said that a national lockdown right now would be inappropriate for places such as East Anglia. Does my right honourable friend therefore disagree with the position of the Labour Party and Ipswich Labour that now is the time to close down the entire hospitality sector in somewhere like Ipswich with low levels of COVID but which employs thousands of my constituents?
Well, I don't think that we should... I do agree, of course, with what Professor Jonathan Van Tam said, and he is a very fine scientist and a brilliant man. And I think that I think that nobody is looking right now for political differences, for politics sense. What people are looking for is people to come together and make the right decisions in the national interest or in the local interest, and to take these decisions as locally as possible to make sure that we support people as much as possible, take action where it is necessary, but make sure that we don't take action where it isn't necessary.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister earlier said he was still talking to the North East. Can I reiterate that in the North East we believe that we should remain in Tier 2 and are working hard to that end? What we do need is financial support for the test and trace work already being carried out effectively locally, and financial support for our hospitality, leisure and retail sectors who are taking the strain of current restrictions. So will he now fund the test and trace work being done so effectively locally, and will he urge the Chancellor to provide a financial support package for our hospitality, leisure and retail sector within Tier 2 to support our economy and our local people?
We are working very closely with the local leadership in the North East and with colleagues. It was very good to see the Honourable Lady on a Zoom call recently to discuss this. I think that it is important that we take the action if it is necessary, but there are early signs that the number of cases in the North East is starting to flatten. In the first instance, that is happening amongst younger people, and I'm still worried about the numbers of cases of over 60s, who, of course, the people who are most likely to end up in hospital or worse. So we will keep a very close eye on the situation, but we have no imminent plans to make a change. And were the clinical advice to change that we needed to move urgently, then of course we would seek to do that with the support of the local area.
We now come to Sarah Brittley.
Weeks, the number of COVID patients admitted to intensive care units in the hospitals in some parts of the country has increased sevenfold, and I agree with my right honourable friend that we must act now to control the spread of the virus. But can he assure me that the government is doing all that it can to keep cancer treatments, elective surgeries and other vital diagnostic services going?
I absolutely can give my honourable friend that assurance, and I had a meeting on this with the NHS only this week. The good news is that the backlog from the initial lockdown has been reduced by 63% of the very long waiters for cancer treatment, those waiting over 104 days. We're working to keep that coming down. Of course, the best way we can make cancer treatment available to everyone, and the best thing in terms of cancer treatment is to keep the rate of coronavirus down. And on the point of fairness, representing a Lancashire seat as she does, I think it's really important that the proposals that we're making in Greater Manchester, the subject of the statement this evening, are equivalent to the proposals that were made for Lancashire, and it is only fair between different geographies that we have the same levels of support, especially neighbouring geographies like Burnham and Manchester.
Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too am working hard with Tees Valley colleagues to keep the area out of Tier 3, but my constituents in Hartlepool are confused and seething with anger. They're concerned about moving to Tier 3 with all the health and economic impacts that will bring. We're not in Tier 3 yet, but if we get there, what exit strategy does he have for ending lockdown?
In the short term, the best exit strategy for anywhere that does go into Tier 3, and I agree with him on his assessment that Hartlepool in Tier 2 at the moment, I hope we can keep it there, but we'll keep it under review. The best exit strategy for anywhere that wants to go into a lower tier is for everybody to follow those rules, respect social distancing, and try to get the case rate coming down. But of course, for the whole nation, indeed for the whole world, the best exit strategy is a combination of mass testing and a vaccine, and we're working incredibly hard to deliver both as quickly as feasibly possible. We need a long-term solution to COVID, as well as the short-term action that we're having to take.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Greater Manchester has lived under harsh additional restrictions for 3 months. Can I put it to my right honourable friend, the lockdowns themselves cost lives as well as livelihoods. that they have a terrible toll on the mental health, particularly of the young. Does he accept that it is better to do these things, if they must be done, by consent? And in that regard, will he confirm that these measures will be brought to this House for approval, and that in any case they will end with a sunset after 28 days?
Yes, I do agree with him that these things are better done by consent. And in the parts of the country where the whole local area has supported the measures, through getting the right messages out to people about their personal responsibility, you do tend to get a better response and see the case rate starting to come down. It's one of the many reasons why we worked so hard to try to get an agreement across Greater Manchester, and one of the reasons why I regret that we haven't been able to, although, as I say, that our door remains open. On the point about consent, of course these measures will be brought to the House, and they sunset after 28 days, and we keep them under review because we wouldn't want to keep these measures in place a moment longer than they're needed.
Jardine.
Mr. Speaker, Secretary of State, none of us doubts the grave threat to public health and the difficulty in dealing with it. But there is also now a widespread real threat of poverty. So whether the 60 million is on the table or off the table is actually immaterial. It's not what the elected representatives of Greater Manchester said they need. So does the Secretary of State appreciate, does his government appreciate that the people of Greater Manchester tonight feel that they have been abandoned by this government, and that my constituents in Edinburgh West and people up and down this country will be wondering if they will be abandoned next?
No, on the contrary, we're putting extra support into Greater Manchester, and we are willing to continue with the support, or akin to the support that we agreed with the leadership of Liverpool City Region and with Lancashire's, my honourable friend who's now gone from the chamber, was setting out. This unprecedented level of support across the whole of this pandemic has only been possible because of the UK acting together and working together. I hope that we can continue to work with her and her party to make sure that we get through this as best we possibly can, suppressing the virus and supporting jobs in the NHS.
John Redwood.
More action is needed to help livelihoods and save incomes. So will the government share and, if necessary, develop its work with the commercial and public sectors over how air conditioning systems, ventilation systems, heating systems, air extraction systems can be adapted or improved so that more of those commercial and public buildings can be kept open for proper use?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's an incredibly important strand of the work. It's being led by the business department, but I keep a close eye on it and, in fact, had an update on it this week, which I'd be very happy to discuss with my right honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister, the Secretary of State, for all that he's doing. There's many underlying conditions, health conditions. One of those is respiratory illnesses. I declare an interest, Mr. Speaker, as the chair of the APPG in respiratory health. And given that respiratory illnesses are one of the leading cause of deaths in the UK, and that includes COVID-19, of course, what reassurances can the Secretary of State offer me and those people who suffer from it, that referrals for severe asthma, COPD and other respiratory illnesses will not be forgotten and will be maintained, and that and avoid further unnecessary deaths?
Well, we work very hard on this point, and actually to answer both this question and a question from my right honourable friend from Trafford, which I didn't answer. Of course we take into account the health impacts, the overall health impacts, both of COVID, direct COVID deaths, the impact of COVID on our hospitals, meaning that it's harder sometimes to treat other illnesses, although that is now much better than it was in the first wave, and the NHS is very much open, and also the impact of measures on other conditions. The best way through this from a health point of view, taking all these things into account, is undoubtedly to keep the virus down, but also to try to make sure that the NHS right across all 4 nations of the UK is open for all other conditions, and that if you are asked to go to hospital, then it is the safest place for you to go.
Mr. Speaker, I understand talks are currently ongoing about South Yorkshire, which includes Rother Valley, going to stricter lockdown. But before any decision is made, will he agree to get agreement between councils and local MPs so that local views, concerns and support is agreed in advance, especially around mental health and local businesses?
Yes, I'd be very happy to agree with my honourable friend. In fact, we were discussing this on Sunday morning on the challenges in South Yorkshire where the cases are going up fast. Action does need to be taken and talks are ongoing in a highly collegiate and constructive way. I pay tribute to the way that my honourable friend stands up for his constituents in the Rother Valley and makes the case directly to ministers day after day about what's best for the area and represents them so clearly.
Let's head to Wales with Geraint Davies. Geraint Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in lockdown, people need the financial support to do the right thing, to stop the virus and stay at home. So in Wales, where we're in national lockdown, the Labour government has provided £300 million. That's £100 per person to help them stay at home to beat the virus. But in Manchester, the Prime Minister has provided £22 million. That's £8 per person instead of £100 per person in Wales. How can this be right? And will he and the Chancellor ensure that wherever you live across the United Kingdom, people have enough money to stay at home to beat the virus without inflicting massive poverty?
Well, of course, we've put in substantially more funding to not just to Greater Manchester, but the UK government is putting substantial funding into Wales that goes directly to businesses that are affected and have to close, that goes directly to individuals, both through the furlough scheme and the job support scheme, and of course universal credit, which is available to all those who lose their jobs and people in low paid work. So in addition to the funding that it remains on the table, and I urge the local leadership in Greater Manchester to come back to the table, there is a very widespread support available.
Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Warrington finds itself as a Tier 2 island in the northwest now, parked between Manchester and Liverpool. Our infection rate remains stubbornly high, though, and admissions to Warrington Hospital have now exceeded the peak of the first wave in April. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that any further measures for Warrington should protect the NHS, should save lives, but also support local livelihoods and the economy?
Yes, I absolutely agree with the approach my honourable friends set out. I am worried about the number of cases in Warrington. I'm worried about the impact on Warrington Hospital, which is an excellent hospital. Of course, Warrington isn't an island because Cheshire as a whole has seen case rates rise. So it is an area that we're worried about, and we're working with the local leadership to make sure that we take the appropriate measures and put in place the support that's needed.
Let's head up to Manchester with Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is impossible to describe today's events without using unparliamentary language. But out of deference to you, I will settle for a complete shambles. Today, this government made a choice not to protect the poorest people in Greater Manchester through the punishing reality of the winter to come. Does the Secretary of State really believe that we will get through this pandemic by subjecting communities to punishing financial negotiations? Does the government truly value pennies more than lives? The governments are playing poker with the people's jobs, their homes, and their lives. So can the Secretary of State tell me, is he proud to be a member of this government?
Mr. Speaker, on the contrary to the way that the honourable gentleman described it, the government has put forward the same proposals in Greater Manchester as was agreed in Lancashire, as was agreed in Liverpool, and unfortunately the Mayor of Greater Manchester walked away from the table, but the offer is there, and I'd urge all of the local leaders, including the honourable gentleman, to take forward the offer that's there to resolve this, and for us all to work together for the benefit of the people of Manchester.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
friend has told the House that these measures are as much about the increase in infection amongst the over 60s, who are obviously more vulnerable to this dreadful disease. We're going to ask him what assessment he's made of whether that infection is being spread in the community as opposed to care settings, and if it is in the community, what messages we should be giving to the rest of the community to protect their loved ones, and how they should be making sure they do that.
I think it's a duty on all of us to send messages to the communities who we serve that people need to take a personal responsibility to try to reduce the spread of this virus. Now, there have been some cases in care homes recently, but far fewer, and it seems that the actions that we've taken and the very hard work of the care home sector over the summer and the staff who work in care homes is reducing the transmission. But naturally, the staff who work in care homes, and most care homes there are more staff than residents, they themselves, of course, live in the community. And so it is almost impossible to stop any infection getting into all care homes when the level of infection in the community rises. Having said that, the core of this second peak is in the community, and it is in the community where every single one of us can act to take more responsibility to help slow the spread of the virus.
Alfie?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, like everyone else's, have suffered huge anxiety over the last 6 months, worried about their health, worried about their livelihoods. And the chaos that has unfolded today in relation to Greater Manchester will have done nothing to allay their fears. But they're also angry. They're angry about the money that has been squandered on the PPE purchases, on the consultants, on the failing test and trace system that my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, raised with the Minister. The Secretary of State didn't answer his questions then. Will he answer them now? Why is Manchester not entitled to the money that it needs to get by through this crisis when so much money is being wasted elsewhere?
Well, the money that we are proposing and put on the table for Greater Manchester is exactly the same as the amount that was agreed with the leadership of Liverpool and of Lancashire, and is the support there to help people through what she's quite right to say are very difficult times. And so I hope that we can resolve this, but we needed to act after 10 days with the infections still going up. We needed to act, and it was our duty to act, even though we couldn't yet get the agreement of the local leaders, but I hope that that will come.
20 is withdrawn, so we go up to Scotland with Richard Thompson. Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the ways that we can hope to pick a path out of this crisis is through improved testing and faster testing. Now, the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister have spoken in past days of new testing technologies being piloted with NHS staff. If this technology is found to be effective, what is his timeline for rolling this testing out to wider groups? And will these tests contribute to the 500,000 daily tests that the government says it will be conducting by the end of the month?
The answer is, Mr. Speaker, yes. And yes, they'll be there to benefit everybody across the whole United Kingdom.
Mary Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, and I was hugely disappointed that the Mayor of Greater Manchester has failed to reach an agreement with the government, thus compounding the uncertainty facing my Cheadle constituents. We need to find a way forward. My right honourable friend will know that I've consistently advocated on behalf of Stockport Council and for my constituents in Cheadle, referring to testing and tracing and COVID compliance in the hospitality sector, and pressed for a borough-by-borough approach that reflects our lower case rate. I've tonight written to the leader of Stockport Council, urging her to act on behalf of my Cheadle constituents and work with the government to negotiate a local authority-specific financial package which supports and protects Cheadle residents and businesses. As we consider the next steps, will the Minister continue to work with me and our local leaders to secure a fair deal for our area?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady puts the case very clearly, and she's right. We don't want businesses in Stockport to be disadvantaged, and so an offer proportionate to the support that we put into Liverpool and Lancashire is on the table, and I will take away her proposal and talk to my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, who's engaged in these talks right now, and her suggestion of a borough-by-borough approach, we remain open to a GM-wide approach, but so far we haven't been able to get the agreement of the Mayor to the support that is there on the table for the businesses of Greater Manchester.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement that he has no plans to move the North East into Tier 3, and he's right. In County Durham, COVID numbers are plateauing, especially if you take out of the students. But could he address the point raised by my honourable friend, the member for Blaydon? When will he give the extra resources to local directors of public health to do local test and tracing? And can I also ask him, when will local directors of public health get the timely information from national test and tracing so that in those cases they can actually chase them up? Because at the moment they're getting them up to 48 hours after the case.
He's keen. The questions were so good, Mr. Speaker. I was enthusiastic to answer them as quickly as possible. I'm a fan of fast turnaround times, and I hope that I can ensure that they get turned around. The data gets turned around even more quickly in County Durham. We clearly, when it comes to the case rate, yes, there have been good signs. I am still worried about the case rate amongst the over 60s, and the discussions with local leaders continue, but I absolutely take his points on board.
With 24 withdrawn, so we're straight across to Derek Twig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In view of the Secretary of State is in favour of fast turnaround times, can I ask him this? Given that Lancashire and now Manchester in Tier 3 will be able to keep their gyms open, can I specifically ask the Secretary of State, will he either use the government's powers or give the powers to local council leaders in Halton and Merseyside to reopen gyms in that area?
He's making an argument that the honourable member for Southport has also consistently made, and I'm willing to. Well, why don't we have a conversation about it and see whether we can make any progress?
Speaker, we know infection rates are at very different levels across the country. We know restrictions cause issues for sufferers from other health conditions than COVID and have a huge impact upon the economy. But closing pubs in Harrogate or Newquay will not make case levels fall in Manchester or Newcastle. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that a blanket national lockdown is wrong and local interventions are what we need now to tackle this crisis?
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. The localised and regional approach is increasingly being taken up around the world. For instance, in France, indeed in Sweden, which has often been discussed in this House, has put in place a system very similar to ours for exactly the sorts of reasons he set out.
I bet.
Speaker, as the Secretary of State will know from the Zoom call that we had on Sunday morning, for which I thank him, the Mayor and leaders of the Sheffield City region are engaged with ministers and officials about a number of asks in order that move to a Tier 3 could be considered. Those asks are about extra help for businesses, those that aren't completely shut but have a substantial reduction in income, and more help beyond the £500 scheme for people who are asked to isolate. Could the Secretary of State correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed from his answers to previous questions that what he's saying is the offer made so far to Lancashire and Merseyside is the final offer that anyone else could expect to receive, and no one else will get any more, particularly in terms of revenue or resources, than has been offered to those areas. Is that true or not?
That's an over-interpretation of my comments, I'd say. The discussions with the local leadership in South Yorkshire have been very constructive, very positive, all focused on the health and the public health needs to get this virus under control in South Yorkshire, and then the support that needs to go alongside that. They're being led by my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, and I wouldn't want to fetter the privacy in which those discussions have rightly taken place. And I think we should leave it to the local leaders and my right honourable friend to try to come to a conclusion.
Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am sure that the Secretary of State is as disappointed as I am
that the Greater Manchester Mayor has been unable to reach agreement with the government today. Would he and other right honourable colleagues now commit to meet with myself, other Greater Manchester colleagues and council leaders in Greater Manchester in order to find a fair and workable agreement?
Yes, absolutely. The support, proportionate to the support that was made available to Lancashire, is on the table, and we're willing to meet anybody from Greater Manchester to help to make this happen. And it is best done as a team effort. The offer was there on the table. I, like him, regret that it wasn't taken forward, but I hope that both council leaders in Wigan, colleagues from across the House, and if he wants to, the Mayor will come back to the table and work together for the people of Greater Manchester.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Health Secretary's attempt to divide and rule the Mayor and the members of Parliament in Manchester is absolutely transparent, and it's shameful that some of those colleagues across the way who have been working collectively should collapse like they appear to be doing today. But doesn't it say everything about this government that they should believe £7,000 a day is an adequate amount to pay consultants to work on his failing track and trace programme, but that £8 per head is more than enough for people in Manchester and right across the North and Midlands to go into this Tier 3 after the Tier 2 programme hasn't worked?
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we're working hard across party lines and trying to rise above that sort of political attack to work for the benefit and the public interest of everybody in this country.
Tom Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Gedling, which does not have a large student population, there continues to be a worryingly high number of coronavirus cases, and it's concerning to hear that the general picture appears to be moving upwards on the population, particularly amongst the over 60s, where we know the risks are higher. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this demonstrates the importance of acting fast with targeted action that is available to help save lives?
Yes, I strongly agree, and I praise my honourable friend's leadership in his local community in making this case. The number of cases in Nottingham and increasingly across Nottinghamshire are worrying. Nottinghamshire went into level 2 last week, and talks are ongoing about what more might be needed. And I praise the people of Nottinghamshire for what they're doing to try to slow the spread of this virus. It may be that more needs to be done. We will be driven entirely by the data and working closely with the local authorities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Secretary of State, Cheshire leaders, indeed the Warrington leader, has met with the department, written to the Prime Minister, asking for local resources for a local test, trace and isolate system, as well as a substantial financial package of £42 million to support our hospitality sector, which people have mirrored across the room. They've yet to have a reply. So, given the urgency of the situation, please do your utmost, make sure that reply goes to the leaders. Finally, as a Mancunian by birth, then I find the spitefulness from the Prime Minister disgraceful. Do the right thing by the people of Greater Manchester, Prime Minister.
Well, the Prime Minister is seeking precisely to do that, and he, like me, he very much hopes that the local leadership in Greater Manchester will do their bit. When it comes to Cheshire and indeed Warrington, that we talked about earlier, I am worried about the cases, and I'll make sure that the engagement that he and his council seek happens as soon as possible.
Sent to Cheshireman, Amersham with Dame Cheryl Gillan. Dame Cheryl.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Secretary of State for his localised approach and the calm way in which he is dealing with some unwarranted attacks on both him and the Prime Minister. The Epilepsy Society is based in Chalfont St Peter in my constituency and provides specialist care to a number of vulnerable residents and has, according to one relative, worked wonders in keeping residents safe and secure. However, but visits from relatives cannot take place as the incidences of COVID-19 grow, and the home is now locked down again. With 60-minute tests now available down the road at Heathrow Airport, could we not arrange for this type of testing for close relatives so they could visit their loved ones? It would make all the difference in the world to my constituents and many others in long-term care.
The answer is yes. We absolutely want to use this sort of testing as it becomes more widely available to do exactly the sort of thing that my right honourable friend sets out. Yes.
Let's head to Greater Manchester with Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just say, Mr. Speaker, how shocked I am in terms of some of the responses of their Health Secretary. All Andy Burnham and the leaders of the Greater Manchester local authorities have been trying to do is to ensure that their constituents, our constituents, are not plunged into poverty, into homelessness and worse. That's all they've been trying to do. So to describe it as in the way it has is really upsetting. But Mr. Speaker, international evidence shows that key requirements for local lockdowns to work are firstly, that you have a competent test, trace and isolate system. Secondly, that businesses and workers are supported by a financial package equivalent to existing incomes. And finally, that national government supports local leaders. So, Mr. Speaker, the government has failed to deliver any of those. So are they following the evidence or not?
We're working incredibly hard to support the action that's needed to suppress this virus whilst protecting the NHS and schools and supporting the economy as much as is possible. When it comes to the work in Greater Manchester, absolutely that is our goal, that is the work that we're doing, and I really hope that given that this that the support proportionate to that support already agreed in Lancashire and Liverpool is on the table, I hope that local leaders will work with us.
Desmond Swain.
What estimate has he made of the number of excess deaths above the long-term average in each of the last few weeks?
Well, we have thankfully seen that the number of excess deaths is around at the level of the long-term average. I want to keep it that way, and that's why we're taking the action that we are, so that this doesn't get out of hand like we saw in the first peak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a pattern here, isn't there? Whenever the government can't agree a deal, it's always somebody else's fault. In this case, Andy Burnham's fault for simply standing up for what Greater Manchester needs, not what we want, what we need. Now, maybe I'm also over-interpreting the Secretary of State's comments, but in his answer to my honourable friend from Sheffield South East, he suggested there might be different offers for different areas. Now, Greater Manchester was asking for a carefully costed package to meet our needs and our requirements. Why can't the government just give Greater Manchester what we need?
Well, the offer that was made to Greater Manchester was proportionate to the support that we've already given to and agreed with the local leadership in Liverpool and in Lancashire, and I regret that the Mayor rejected it. But we want to support businesses across Greater Manchester, and so we are open to further discussions with local leaders, including with the council leaders, as my honourable friend suggested, about business support, and I hope that we can make some progress.
36 withdrawn, so we'll go up to Kingston upon Hull with Dame Dinah Johnson. Dinah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Andy Burnham has said that on COVID-19, we need to carry the people with us, not crush their spirit. So does the Health Secretary think that he has carried the people of the North with the government as they watch bully boy tactics and punishment beatings being used against the legitimate concerns of local leaders from all parties to try and protect the livelihoods of the poorest and local businesses in Greater Manchester? And how does this bode for other areas such as the Humber, which may well need more help as they move into higher tiers?
Areas like South Yorkshire, like West Yorkshire, like the North East, like Nottinghamshire, that we're already in discussions with. Those discussions right across the board are constructive, are positive, and are focused entirely on the well-being of the people locally. And I hope that I hope that in Hull cases stay relatively low and we don't have to go into a higher tier. There are no plans to do so at the moment, and I urge the people of Hull to keep following the rules and keep the coronavirus down in Hull. But what I would say is that in every other part of the country, we've had highly constructive talks that haven't involved this sort of party political point scoring, and I would urge that approach from everybody.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of South Cambridgeshire, the latest figures show an infection rate of just 54 per 100,000, about half the national average and 1/10 the rate in Liverpool. So I think it's absolutely right the government isn't following a national lockdown, but is instead following the regional, local approach. But in those areas that do need to go to Tier 3, it's absolutely right the government gives additional financial support, but it's also right, surely, that the government treats them fairly and equally, and the government couldn't give greater support to one area, Greater Manchester, than to Liverpool or Lancashire, because then those local leaders that are refusing to take the action necessary to lock down the virus will be given greater financial rewards than those leaders that are taking the steps necessary.
This point about fairness is really important. Imagine how it would feel. Imagine how it would feel to be running a business or being somebody who lives in Liverpool when an agreement has been struck across party lines for the support that comes with the measures that are necessary. If then after a very public disagreement, instead of the constructive work that we really, really hope on this side to achieve, if there as a result was a deal that was not proportionate and fair. Fairness is absolutely at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here, and that is why it is of course right that we have the extra offer of support continues to be on the table. We want to strike a fair deal, but we have to take these measures to keep people safe.
And in fairness, Secretary of State, if you could address me, will be also helpful. Not just your back. That's great. Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his statement, the Secretary of State has said to the people of Manchester, we will be by your side, and that his response requires for all of us to make tough sacrifice. I put it to him that that's not entirely true, is it? Because it's constituencies like mine of Bradford West that are making the real tough sacrifices with facing restrictions for nearly 3 months because of his and his government failings. Just so we are aware, will this government try to play poker with the people of Bradford and their financial support like it did with Manchester before putting it into the highest tier?
Very closely with Bradford, with the council in Bradford, and of course I'm very happy to talk to her about what might be necessary. It has been very difficult for Bradford these past few months. I absolutely appreciate that. Bradford has been, and certainly the city of Bradford that she represents, has been in measures for a long time and had extra restrictions. And I hope that we can bring the number of cases down so that we can release some of those restrictions, and that's best done working together.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the setting up of a second local national testing centre locally in Fenton Manor in my constituency. And I thank the City Council and health professionals for the work that they've been doing locally. Would my right honourable friend continue to support this excellent work and continue to grow the testing capacity?
Yes, 100%. I think my honourable friend makes a very good point that the extra testing capacity that we're seeing across the country doesn't happen by magic. It happens by the hard work of his constituents and others who are playing their part in the testing regime, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head up to Manchester with Barbara Keeley. Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Secretary of State talks about fairness, but we've today found out that Greater Manchester is effectively getting a third of the level of financial support that the government gave to Lancashire. And I say to the Secretary of State, it's a failure that his government cannot negotiate a decent package of support with our Greater Manchester Mayor. Now, Andy Burnham has argued for that decent financial support for people who work in businesses that are going to be closed down by government restrictions and for resources for locally led test and trace. He was right to do that. I urge the Secretary of State to think again. This is too important a time in this pandemic to fail to work with the devolved local government system that his government created.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's time to put aside short-term political point scoring, and the deal on the table that the Mayor of Greater Manchester walked away from was a fair deal that had been agreed, proportionate to the deal that had been agreed with leaders in Liverpool and in Lancashire. And I know I keep repeating this point, but it is absolutely at the centre of what it is to be fair, which is about treating people in similar situations in a similar way. And I think that the British people understand that, and hence we enter into these local discussions in good faith, and everywhere else they've been engaged in good faith, and I hope that's the way that they can continue, and I hope that's how they can continue in Greater Manchester in the future, Mr. Speaker.
William Wright. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to be fair to my right honourable friend, who is motivated at all times by the best of intentions. But I do gently say this, that those of us who have a contrary view to all of the government's policies are not in immediate tow with the Mayor of Greater Manchester, nor are we in tow with the Labour opposition. I feel a deep sense of disappointment at this collective failure that we have seen today, and quite frankly, my constituents in Hazel Grove deserve better. And I shall resist the urge to lose my temper, Mr. Speaker, because these exchanges, tempting though it may be, these exchanges deserve a greater elevation of tone. But I say this, the definition of insanity is to continue to do the same thing over and over again in the hope that it will turn good. Now, we have had 3 months of interventions in Greater Manchester, which have yielded very little results indeed. I cannot but help but fear that the medicine is worse than the disease.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, we are starting to see some of the local action that we've already taken just starting potentially to work. And we have seen in Bolton that the cases were shooting up before we took action and then levelled off. So there is evidence of this approach working. And I look forward to working with my honourable friend and working with him to make sure we can get out of these measures, which I appreciate he's unenthusiastic about, as soon as possible.
We're heading up to Manchester for our final question with Lucy Powell. Lucy Powell.
Thank you for squeezing me in, Mr. Speaker. Can I just say it wasn't just the Mayor, but it was all the leaders and most of the MPs across Greater Manchester. We are a city united this evening. But shouldn't any economic support package be based on need, not some unpublished arbitrary formula that no one's got any idea what it consists of? Because if it was based on need, it would take account of the fact that business density and the economy of Greater Manchester is bigger than in other areas, and that we have many more low-paid workers. That's something he should know if he's talking about fairness. So businesses in Manchester will actually receive a lot less than businesses elsewhere. And can I tell him tonight that his government has really misjudged the mood up here, and any less than is needed coming immediately to Greater Manchester for these new restrictions would rightly be seen as spiteful and political and nothing whatsoever to do with public health.
Well, I think it benefits all of us to rise above the politics and try to work together. And as I say, the offer that was made remains on the table, and I look forward to working with the Honourable Lady, who I know works with the best, as my old friend said over here, works with the best of intentions. And I hope that we can work together to try to tackle this dreadful disease.
Right, for those who wish to leave the chamber, please do so before I start putting the next motions. Okay, folks. Sure. Yeah. Right, we're now going to come to the motions 4 to 7. I'm going to take them individually. So I'm going to start with motion number 4, Minister, to move.
I beg to move.
Objection taken. The division will be deferred tomorrow. We come to motion number 5, Public Health.
I beg to move.
Objection taken. The division is deferred till tomorrow. We now come to motion number 6, Public Health. Minister.
I beg to move.
Objection taken. The division is deferred until tomorrow. We come to 7, Community Infrastructure Law.
I beg to move. Object.
Objection taken, and objection taken. The division is deferred till tomorrow. We now come to motion number 9 on the General Synod Remote Readings Temporary Standing Orders measure. Andrew Salou to move.
I beg to move.
Oh, well, we managed to get one through. Well done. Congratulations. Accepted. We now come to the presentation of petitions, and I start with Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2015, at least once every year to 18 months, a bank is closed in Glasgow North. And although this closure in today's petition is just over the boundary in the constituency of my honourable friend from Glasgow North West, it serves a wide area across Partick, the West End and beyond. And its closure is just another nail in the coffin of high streets and community shopping and services. It's another example of banks making claims about footfall and usage that simply don't seem to match the experience of anyone who actually visits or uses the branch. Banks of all brands must do better. We need imagination and commitment to communities so that the most disadvantaged are not further penalised by lack of access to basic services. So the petition of residents of Glasgow North declares that the proposed closure of the Partick branch of the TSB Bank in Glasgow will have a detrimental effect on local communities and the local economy, and the petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urges Her Majesty's Treasury, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and TSB Bank to take account of the concerns of the petitioners and take whatever steps they can to halt the planned closure of this branch and the petitioners remain, etc.
Petition, closure of Partick branch of TSB Bank in Glasgow.
Outcome to petition from Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The closure of 3 TSB branches in my constituency of Glasgow North West will be devastating both for local constituents and for businesses. Both Partick and Anniesland serve vast areas, but due to good public transport links, they can be accessed by those whose own local branches have already closed. In Drumchapel, an area with high digital exclusion and poor transport connectivity, the TSB is the only bank for miles around and is regularly queued out the door. The petition of residents of Glasgow North West declares that the proposed closure of the Anniesland, Drumchapel and Partick branches of the TSB Bank in Glasgow will have a detrimental effect on local communities and the local economy. The petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urges Her Majesty's Treasury, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and TSB Bank to take into account the concerns of petitioners and take whatever steps they can to halt the planned closure of these branches, and the petitioners remain.
Petition, closure of Partick branch of TSB Bank in Glasgow.
We now come petition Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the unfortunately too many of my constituents who rely on universal credit. It's a fact that Tory welfare policies are plunging people into poverty, but child poverty is a scourge of society. Hungry children find it harder to learn, and the reality is their life chances are disadvantaged right from the outset. Now, in Scotland, the Scottish Government has mitigated the worst effects of the poverty and we've got the lowest child poverty rates in the UK, but more is needed from the UK Government. And to that, at least the £20 universal credit top-up has been a lifeline for some during COVID. So, Mr. Speaker, the petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urge the Government to immediately bring forward additional measures to permanently increase universal credit in response to the long-term impact of COVID-19, and the petitioners remain, etc.
Petition, universal credit uplift.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is, this House do now adjourn. Siobhan MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the other members here this evening. In just 36 hours, schools will be legally required to provide online lessons to all pupils self-isolating due to coronavirus. In theory, a sensible suggestion ensuring that no parent has to choose between the health and education of their child. But in practice, and in the shadow of the digital divide, it's the latest of the Department for Education's ill-thought-through pandemic proposals, pushing the patience of our hard-working teachers to their limits. In my speech, I will reveal the horrifying extent of the digital divide across our country. I will consider the practical constraints that need to be urgently overcome for teachers to provide online learning, and I will offer a solution to the Minister following the Government's woefully inadequate in advance of these new requirements. But first, lockdown. Because my own journey into the digital divide started back in March following a conversation with Debbie, an amazing health visitor in my constituency, who had just visited temporary accommodation to 86 homeless families, lockdown would present challenges for all of us. But spare a thought for these families in cramped rooms with no outside space and, as Debbie pointed out to me, no internet connection. It's indisputable how vital the internet has been for us all in this time, unlocking the chance to remain in contact with loved ones, to take part in online exercise classes, and to work and learn from home despite the closure of offices and schools. But this lifeline was not available to all. The lockdown exposed the digital divide across the UK, with 11% of the population without home internet access and an estimated 9% of children without access to a laptop, desktop or tablet. Ofcom estimate the numbers to be up to an extraordinary 1.78 million children in the UK. So whilst the government promoted their investment in the online Oak Academy, let us be clear that no number of online lessons could benefit those children unable to log in from home. This was not the fault of their schools. The pandemic presented the most testing environment to teach in, and I've lost count of the extraordinary examples of teachers going above and beyond for their pupils. The dedication should be celebrated and shouted from the rooftops. And some schools, like the outstanding Ursuline High School attended by many of my constituents, even showed that they were already at the forefront of technology, with every pupil given a tablet and receiving 6 lessons a day from home. Mr. Speaker, if they weren't logged in by 9 a.m, the school was on to the parents right away, of course.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady from Mitchin and Morton for bringing this forward. Education, as the Honourable Lady is saying, is so important, and I'm very pleased to see the Minister in his place, and we'll be looking for exceptional response from you, Minister, by the way. But just to say this, does the Honourable Member not agree that, especially with children facing exams after losing months this year, that it's vital they have access to learning at home, put into isolation, and that every hour of teaching is necessary, and further, that it is imperative that government should make additional resources available to help staff also remotely teach as needed?
I completely agree with the Honourable Member, and I'm not sure if he's aware that a quarter of children on free school meals did less than 1 hour's schoolwork a day during lockdown, whilst staggering data from the Children's Commission indicates that over 58% of primary and just under half of secondary school pupils were being provided no online lessons whatsoever. There can be no doubt those children who couldn't access the same resources as their classmates will have returned to school even further behind. It is fundamental that they catch up. Of course, those of us who recognise the problem did not idly stand by. Whilst the government struggled to source and distribute data and devices, extraordinarily charitable efforts within so many of our constituents secured laptops, tablets and SIM cards to ensure that children had the chance to stay connected. I am personally grateful to Leica Mobile, Email, 3, Craig Russell and all at Tesco Mobile, my local Aberdeen Muslim community and the simply brilliant Don's Local Action Group for their extraordinary generosity in providing hundreds of devices and data to children in my constituency. I commend the impressive pledges made by BT and 3 to keep many of the most vulnerable families connected. And I know that my honourable friend for Wolverhampton South East is particularly grateful to an extraordinary councillor in his borough, Councillor Beverly Moman-Bardi, for her tireless work in securing devices for her residents.
Can I thank my honourable friend for her amazing work on this most crucial of issues, and join her in praising the excellent work of Councillor Beverly Moman-Bardi, who is the City Innovation Digital Champion for Wolverhampton. Her survey of pupils and schools has shown that At 5 primary schools in the city, over half the pupils have no access to a Wi-Fi connection at home, and pupils at many more schools lack a suitable device with which to study online. Does my honourable friend agree that with about 400,000 pupils being sent home because a COVID case has been identified in their school, it is essential to ensure that children have access both to a Wi-Fi connection as well as the laptops and other hardware they need in order to stop this situation exacerbating educational inequality that already exists?
I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and I would like to thank all those charitable efforts during lockdown. But it cannot be right that educational opportunity for our children during lockdown was dependent on a lottery of charitable giving. Mr. Speaker, this is not just an issue of access, it is an issue of deprivation, and it should be right at the top of the government's levelling up agenda. Because data from the ONS reveals that only 51% of households earning between £6,000 and £10,000 have internet access, compared with 99% of households earning over £40,000. Whilst 30.7% of private school pupils attended 4 or more online lessons per day, only 6.3% of state school pupils did the same. And however damning the statistics sound, don't be misled. Being connected is one thing, but more than 880,000 children live in households with only one mobile internet connection. I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but mum's mobile doesn't strike me as an acceptable solution to logging in and learning from home. No wonder the Oak Academy data shows that pupils were accessing lessons through games consoles, mobile phones, old tablets. But for those families using pay-as-you-go streaming online lessons costs an astronomical £37 a day, another ill-thought-through policy hitting the poorest hardest. No one should underestimate the digitally connected world we now live in and assume that this is a short-term problem. Secondary school pupils spend on average 1 hour and 37 minutes a week on schoolwork through the internet, every click widening the digital divide in our society. Before lockdown, children on free school meals were leaving school 18 months behind their classmates, and the gap was getting worse. The digital divide will manifest itself by giving those from the wealthiest background an advantage over the other children. We can't let coronavirus make our society even more unequal and unfair, whatever happened to levelling up. But this isn't just a manifesto commitment. In just 36 hours, the digital divide changes from a political debate to a legal requirement, with schools obliged to provide online lessons to the increasing numbers of children self-isolating at home. I anticipate that the Minister will celebrate from the dispatch box the small number of devices already distributed by the government. But however you look at it, the numbers simply don't add up. There were 540,000 children eligible under the government's initial scheme to provide devices to disadvantaged learners, but only 200,000 devices and 50,000 routers to give away. The whole system was chaotic and ad hoc, with some children receiving devices regardless of whether they already had one, and others not arriving till July, too late for term time and months into the world of remote education. Staggeringly, even now, 7 months after schools closed and the government support package for remote education still has a large section entitled Remote Education Support, Available Soon. Teachers are sick and tired of information leaks before midnight, document updates and vague press release. The message being conveyed to schools is that they are accountable from Thursday and will face consequences if remote education is not in place. But, Mr. Speaker, how can the department expect schools to be ready to provide remote education if they themselves are not? More devices have finally been pledged, but the numbers still fall far short of the need. Where is the drive or the ambition? I quote directly from the head teacher of an Ofsted outstanding school in my constituency. She says, Today in school, the leadership team has been trying to work out exactly how to address the legislative changes when around 1/3 of pupils do not have devices. Frankly, we don't know what to do. And importantly, the government do not seem to recognise that a device is only as effective as the internet connection it's used with. No matter how expensive, how smart, how modern the device distributed is, it is rendered useless if it comes without the data or dongle needed to link in from home. Why haven't the department engaged with all the mobile virtual network operators? After all, the families on the lowest incomes are unlikely to have contracts with the bigger providers. Meanwhile, the Alliance for Inclusive Education note that there is nothing in the guidance about the provision of adaptive and assistive technologies. But with the clock ticking, 4 of my local schools contacted me urgently this morning. The first has 79 pupils unable to access remote learning online. The second has 60 students that still need to access their own devices, and that doesn't take into account those who share devices with siblings. The third has an extraordinary 31% of Key Stage 2 pupils with just a mobile connection or no internet at all. And the fourth has had a coronavirus outbreak, but laptops ordered from the Department for Education have no time frame for delivery, and 15% of children are yet to log in from home. Please can the Minister clearly in his response tell me when will St Thomas of Canterbury get its 47 devices? Because whilst the government points to the COVID-funded provider to support schools from the emergency devices can be purchased, there's no spare change once cleaning supplies, new desks, sinks, chairs, fencing, signage, red tape, face masks, thermometers, aprons, gloves and more have all been purchased. And so I ask the Minister, whose responsibility is it to ensure that these children have the data and devices required? Teachers need to know tonight, because many of them are understandably at the end of their tether. I quote one directly. What was the Department for Education's biggest failure during lockdown? Not providing schools with the resources or funding to ensure every child who did not have access to the internet or suitable devices for remote learning would receive one. With the best will in the world, this was a short turnaround. We all understand that it could not be achieved overnight, but it's worth noting that schools were expected to move mountains overnight. The department required them to do so. Another teacher told me she's already working through her breaks and bringing masses of work home. She asked if the Minister can clarify how she is expected to mark home learning, how she can give constructive feedback to isolated pupils, and when in the school day she is to provide the full day of extra lessons. The language used by a third teacher was a bit less parliamentary. When on earth in our working hours are we doing this is perhaps a translation. And we must not underestimate the practical difficulties facing school. How does a teacher simultaneously teach half their class in person and half online? For the younger primary pupils, how can they be expected to sit attentively in front of a screen throughout the whole day? And what about the arts, music or drama? Are these subjects to be sacrificed in the online world? Add in a crashed computer or broken microphone and the barriers facing classrooms are clear. What's more, no one should underestimate the importance of child protection issues. Teachers have told me horror stories this week of children taking the iPad to the toilet and of mum swearing in front of a class of horrified primary students. I wholeheartedly appreciate the importance of ensuring that no child falls even further behind their education, and I'm confident that the practical difficulties outlined can be overcome. But the government cannot just pin the obligations on schools without giving them every ounce of support and guidance that they need. In the statistics I shared this evening, we can be in no doubt that without urgent support, the online lesson requirement will fail those children on the wrong side of the digital divide. But the government knew this was coming and they were too slow to act. Back in June, I shared a cross-party warning directly with the Secretary of State, calling for all children entitled to free school meals to have internet access and adequate device at home. not just my view, but the view of 4 former education secretaries, 4 former children's ministers, the former head of Ofsted, the Labour Shadow Education Secretary, the Conservative Chair of the Education Select Committee, the Liberal Democrat Education Spokesman, the chairs of the APPGs for Children, Education, Social Mobility and Digital Skills, a whole number of children's charities, unions, think tanks, MPs, academics, and even my favourite former Prime Minister. I am now looking to ensure the backing of a wonderful young Premier League striker from Manchester. Because digital exclusion is not an issue which directly resulted from the pandemic, and nor will it subside with it. The importance of closing the digital divide extends far beyond the classroom. But coronavirus has shone a light on this inequality, highlighting the critical role that adequate access to safe, high-quality online learning resources at home plays in children's lives. Without supporting schools with the means to adhere to this new legal requirement, these educational inequalities will only be exacerbated. That can simply not be right. Because surely no matter what corner of this chamber we sit in, we can all agree that no child's education should be dependent on their internet connection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by congratulating the Honourable Lady, the member for Mitcham and Morden, on securing this debate. Ensuring children continue to receive their education during this pandemic is critical to ensure this generation of school children reach their potential, as well as to prevent a widening of the attainment gap, something I share the same objective as the Honourable Member. It is thanks to the outstanding efforts of our teachers and staff that pupils are continuing to receive the education and opportunities they deserve in the face of the pandemic. Now, we recognise that all children and young people have had their education disrupted as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. The Department is committed to the continuation of high-quality education for all pupils during this period. Now, we know that schools and colleges worked extremely hard over the summer to prepare for full reopening, as well as to develop remote education contingency plans. And this is testament to their commitment to ensuring that any missed education is recovered and that we prevent the attainment gap from widening further. And we have a shared responsibility for working to ensure that this generation of young people do not face long-term disadvantage. Now, the government was clear that pupils in all year groups and from all types of school should return to school full-time from the beginning of the autumn term. And figures show that as at the 15th of October, 99.7% of schools were open. Over 7 million children and young people are back in school, representing 89% of pupils across the country. And we are continuing to do everything in our power to ensure that every child can continue to attend school safely, as this is the best place for them to be for their education, for their development and for their well-being. Now, the Department works closely with other public health bodies to monitor the rate and transmission of the virus. On the 15th of October, approximately 0.1% of pupils in state schools were self-isolating because they had tested positive for the coronavirus. 0.5% were self-isolating with a suspected case of coronavirus, and between 3.9% and 4.3% of pupils were self-isolating because they had been in contact with a potential case. Now, we recognise that for some pupils, remote education may need to be an essential component alongside classroom teaching. And in these circumstances, the government wants to ensure that there is no doubt about the roles and responsibility within the system for providing that remote education. And that is why the Secretary of State issued a temporary continuity direction on the 1st of October to give clarity that schools have a duty to provide remote education for state-funded school-aged children who are unable to attend school due to the coronavirus pandemic, in line with guidance and the law. Now, these link to the remote education expectations that the Department published for schools on the 2nd of July. They say that the direction says that schools have to have regard to that guidance, and that guidance has been available to schools since the 2nd of July, and it sets out very clearly the expectations that we have for the quality and breadth of remote education. Mr. Speaker, ensuring schools can provide a high quality of remote education was and continues to be a key part of our work to support schools. So alongside the direction, the Department also announced further remote educational support intended to help schools and colleges in meeting the remote education expectations. And the support package is available over the coming months, and parts of it are available now, I should say to the Honourable Lady, to support schools and colleges seeking additional support, which can be found on the Get Help with Remote Education page on gov.uk. Now, we have invested over £160 million to support remote education. And as part of this, during the summer term, we delivered over 220,000 laptops and tablets for disadvantaged children who would not otherwise have access to the internet. It was one of the largest procurements of computers in the UK. And on one particular day, 27,000 computers were being delivered on a single day. Now, we are now supplementing this support, Mr. Speaker, by making available 250,000 additional laptops and tablets for disadvantaged children in years 3 to 11 in the event that face-to-face schooling is disrupted this term as a result of the pandemic. By the end of this week, Mr. Speaker, we will have delivered, since the beginning of term, 100,000 of that 250,000 computers to schools. Now, the Honourable Lady referred to St Thomas of Canterbury Primary School, and she sent me a letter today, and we did check the status of the school's order with my officials as a consequence of the Honourable Member sending me that letter. So St Thomas of Canterbury's Primary School's order of 47 laptops, according to my officials, was received on Friday, the 16th of October, and we expect the laptops will be dispatched to them tomorrow. So the Honourable Member has achieved some piece of information by orchestrating this debate this evening. Now, we are also working with the major telecoms companies to improve internet connectivity for disadvantaged and vulnerable families. The Department is piloting an approach where, for families who rely on a mobile internet connection, mobile network operators will provide temporary access to free additional data, offering them more flexibility to access the resources that they need the most. I have to give way to the Honourable Member.
What is becoming increasingly, I'm becoming increasingly aware of, is we know that being poor means you pay your bills differently, whether it's electricity meters or gas meters. Pay-as-you-go mobiles from not the mainstream mobile providers, by GiftGo, by Leica Mobile, by all those, are how they get their data. Can I ask the Minister what he's doing about those sorts of areas?
With her permission, I will write to the Honourable Member about that so that I get the facts absolutely right. We are very concerned about these issues, and that's why we have provided over 50,000 4G routers to homes and those other support that I have referred to. But I will write specifically on the point she raises to her. Now, we are funding expert technical support and training to help schools as well. To help set up Google or Microsoft digital education platforms. Now, schools can also access guidance and training from a network of schools and colleges across the country who are leading their way in the use of digital. And these are our EdTech demonstrator schools. A library of resources and materials has been produced by these demonstrator schools to support remote education arrangements, including support for schools who are less digitally able, alongside guidance on how to make use of DFE-funded digital platforms and devices. Now, the programme is proving popular, with well over 1,000 schools and colleges receiving weekly tailored support, and over 5,000 schools and colleges attending live-streamed webinars. To support the hard work of schools in delivering remote education, Oak National Academy, referred to by the Honourable Member, was very quickly brought together, I think within 2 weeks of the pandemic leading to schools closing, by over 40 teachers. Their schools and other education organisations also helped them. Now, the Department has made £4.84 million available for Oak National Academy, both for the summer term of last academic year and then for this 2020-21 academic year, to provide video lessons for a broad range of subjects for reception to Year 11. And Oak will remain a free optional resource for 2020-21. And since the start of the autumn term, 500,000 users have visited the Oak National Academy platform and 3.1 million lessons. So, Mr. Speaker, the government is clear that the best place for children is in school, where they can be with their friends and teachers and can catch up with the education that they may have lost when schools closed to most pupils. But ensuring that that education can continue when schools are required to send children and young people home to self-isolate because of a confirmed case of coronavirus is also vital. And we are providing the support and the devices for the most disadvantaged, and we are providing £1 billion of catch-up funding to ensure that the current generation of school students do not have their long-term prospects damaged by this appalling pandemic that the world is confronting.
The question is this House to now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.